listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another year of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our fragmented country, as well as the fractured and battled surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going into the news this morning, first up in the headlines, at least 2,373 new coronavirus deaths and 291,384 new cases were reported on Saturday, that's January 2nd, and at least 1,353 new COVID deaths and a bit over 200,000 cases were reported yesterday, January 3rd. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 205,000 cases per day, a decrease of 5% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of Sunday evening, more than 20,666,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and approximately 351,000 have died from it. More than 4.2 million people in the United States have received a dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, falling far short of the goal federal officials set to give at least 20 million people their first shots before the end of December. The federal government said Saturday that it had delivered more than 13 million doses to states, territories, and federal agencies, but that federal officials have recently said the vaccine rollout had a slower than expected start, acknowledging that they lack a clear understanding as to why only a small portion of the doses shipped across the nation have as of yet been administered. In India has formally approved the emergency use of two coronavirus vaccines, those coming from AstraZeneca with Oxford University and from local firm Bharat Biotech. This as it prepares for one of the world's biggest inoculation drives. On Saturday, India held nationwide drills to prepare more than 90,000 healthcare workers to administer vaccines across the country, which has a population of 1.3 billion people. India, which makes about 60% of vaccines globally, plans to immunize about 300 million people by July 2021. It will prioritize healthcare workers, the emergency services, and those who are clinically vulnerable because of age or pre-existing conditions. India has also announced that it will not allow the export of the Oxford University AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine for several months, according to the head of Serum Institute of India, which has been contracted to make 1 billion doses of the vaccine for developing nations. As a result, the export of vaccines to developing nations, part of COVAX, won't begin until March or April. That is significant. Again, I'm going to say that again. The India, which produces 60% of vaccines globally, not necessarily COVID vaccines, but they are like one of the major producers of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. They will not begin releasing those to developing countries until March or April, so months into 2021. Until, again, they have their immunization under control, so to speak. 2 weeks into its vaccination campaign, Israel is administering more than 150,000 doses a day. The total batch of initial shots amounted to more than 1 million of its 9 million citizens, a higher proportion of the population than anywhere else in the world. But one massive group is being left out of this rollout. Israel is transporting batches of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine deep into the West Bank, but only to be distributed to Jewish settlers, not the roughly 2.7 million Palestinians living there who may have to wait for weeks or months. The Palestinian Authority is rushing to get its own vaccines, although when asked for a time frame, the Director General of the Palestinian Health Ministry estimated the first vaccines would probably arrive in February. Growing number of Republican senators moving to national political news, led by Ted Cruz, announced on Saturday that they would object to certifying state electoral college votes on Wednesday and called for resurrecting an electoral commission to conduct an emergency audit of the results. In a statement released Saturday, the senators and senators-elect called for Congress to, quote, appoint an electoral commission with full investigatory and fact-finding authority to conduct an emergency 10-day audit of the election returns in the disputed states, end quote. This comes as the House and Senate are set to meet on Wednesday for a joint session in which the individual electoral college counts from each state are announced. And this is a big headline and related sort of, claims of election fraud news. President Trump pressured Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to, quote, find, end quote, him enough votes to overturn the presidential election, and vaguely threatened him with a criminal offense during an hour-long telephone call on Sunday. This is according to an audio recording of the conversation obtained first by the Washington Post. We will be coming back to a longer version of this in just a few minutes during Jamarl's monologue, during our soapbox segment, but we actually have a small snippet of audio to play now. Andre, let's play this clip.
We have won this election in Georgia based on all of this. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, Brad. Having a correct, the people of Georgia are angry. And these numbers are going to be repeated on Monday night, along with others that we're going to have by that time, which are much more substantial even. And the people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
He says wrong. It sounds like I got clipped a little bit early. He says wrong. Embarrassing moment there. And that was certainly, if you go back, you could listen to the whole thing. But the Washington Post has also released a few sort of cut versions of it. That was their first cut. That's their big moment, apparently, as a public official telling the president that he's wrong. Anyway, more to this. As of Sunday evening, all 10 former defense secretaries had released an opinion piece through the Washington Post in which they cautioned acting Defense Secretary Mark Esper and his staff not to, quote, involve the U.S. armed forces in resolving election disputes that would take us into dangerous, unlawful, and unconstitutional territory, end quote, saying that, quote, efforts to involve the U.S. armed forces in resolving election disputes, again, would take us into that territory. Not a good place to enter, and not a good sort of cautionary moment to be having here. Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker of the House for the 117th Congress, clinching that gavel for the fourth time as she now prepares to steer the sharply divided chamber through the final turbulent days of the Trump era. This comes after weeks of concerted pushback from a wing of progressives calling on members of the Progressive Caucus to withhold their votes for Nancy Pelosi's reelection as Speaker unless she pushed for a vote for Medicare for all. Sadly, a failure. Jamarl, I'm curious. I haven't gone to you yet. What's your take on all this stuff? We covered a handful of things here, from Republican senators saying that they would object to certifying state electoral college votes, to this call between President Trump and Georgia's Secretary of State, now to Nancy Pelosi's reelection. What's your take on all of this?
I'll go with the Pelosi one, because initially the Pelosi one was going to be the one that I talked about this morning. But of all things being equal, I find this one to be of less priority. And so I'm going to use the other one, my monologue, to talk about the Trump one. Look, I always ask the question, what leverage do you have at your disposal to do what you're trying to accomplish? I always ask that. Because politics is not about being nice. It's not about beseeching. It's not about begging. It's not about asking. It's about leverage. What leverage do you have at your disposal to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish? And what are you willing to do it? Meaning, if the best that you got is we're going to beg and we're going to yell and we're going to swear and curse and we're going to be disingenuous and we're going to attack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then to some degree, your attack undermines your own attack. I think lefties really need to consider what I'm saying here. If you want to, leave Patreon and all this other stuff because of it, fair enough. If you want to unsubscribe, God bless. But what I'm saying is correct, even though it's nuanced. The force to vote thing was absolutely correct. It is appalling on an ungodly radical level that they didn't force the vote, that they didn't even get that this was correct. In fact, what they are arguing is that they got a small tweak in the provision of pay-go, as if all of these radical Democrats, the Cory Bushes of the world, the Bowmans of the world, that they got in for incrementalism. That's the argument. And I don't buy that argument. I don't think they put Bowman in for incrementalism. I don't think they put Bush in for incrementalism. For that matter, I don't think they put AOC in for incrementalism. And this kind of running back to the group saying, hey, we got pay-go, with the Ryan Grimms of the world, the people who are basically backing Elizabeth Warren, saying, hey, This is great. Mind you, the Grims of the world also was trying to tell us that Warren was backing Medicare for all, so I take that with a dim view. Look, this is horrible. I mean, I understand that they think that this is good politics. I understand that they think that this tweak is sufficient. It's not. The tweak to pay go is not sufficient because you still have a leadership that basically takes a dim view of Medicare for all. They need to get into their heads that they are on the outs. Nancy Pelosi was literally in the meetings to stop Sanders. She was perfectly okay with Markey being challenged by Kennedy, despite the fact that she was on board for the blacklisting lefty organizations that tried to topple incumbents. I guess I'm saying at some point, the squad, quote unquote, being called Fraud Squad now, needs to get into their heads that these guys are not on the same team and that being on the outs confers a certain strength in and of itself by being willing to push for items without this, hey, we'll give you this tiny penny if you go along with us. Okay, let's do it. That is not the way to get politics done. That is not the way to get your base riled up. In fact, it's the opposite because it demoralizes your base. It makes your base angry at you. And your opponents use the fact that your base is angry at you for gamesmanship. Meaning, it's like you have Republicans who are like, hey, let's primary AOC. And you have a bunch of lefties who are like, yeah, let's do that. It's like, are you insane? Like, no, this is horrible. It's horrible. I mean, they should have did it on principle alone, from my standpoint.
I hear you. You refuse to vote her back in for another term as Speaker. That's what you're talking about there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what justification? Nancy Pelosi gave up $1.8 trillion for half. Nancy Pelosi lost seats in the House at a time where they were supposed to win seats. They weren't able to get Medicare for all passed, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the public backs, I think like 88% of Democrats. Like, where does it go in when the person fails? When do you get to choose another Speaker of the House? And if the lefties just feel like they're stuck into choosing this, then what does it mean to be a lefty in Congress? I mean, yeah, I have some serious qualms with their failure on this, failure to even throw a punch.
I hear you. That's kind of what I was worried about. I'll be honest. It's kind of what I was worried about when the Force the Vote campaign sort of first started, when we first started talking about it, at least a couple of weeks ago. And then I changed my tune pretty quickly. But if you remember, I changed my tune sort of conditionally on the idea that this was used motivationally to build some sort of institution or political movement with momentum. And it seemed like the People's Party was trying to do something like that and maybe succeeding, maybe has succeeded in some form at doing something like that. But if all you're doing is disappointing yourself, then you're going to have a bad time, so to speak. You're not actually making progress. You're just sort of losing traction while your rubber loses its thread. I don't know. We need to do a couple more headlines, but I'm sure we'll be talking about this more throughout the show and with our guests. In international news, UK District Judge Vanessa Barretzer has ruled to reject the U.S. request to extradite WikiLeaks founder and whistleblower Julian Assange. This is a big one. Barretzer indicated that extradition would have a harmful effect on Assange's mental health, and said she has ruled against the U.S. request due to fears that the whistleblower has a high risk of committing suicide as a result. In her full ruling, Barretzer wrote, quote, "I accept that oppression as a bar to extradition requires a high threshold. However, I am satisfied that in these harsh conditions, Mr. Assange's mental health would deteriorate, causing him to commit suicide with the single-minded determination of his autism spectrum disorder," end quote. The U.S. said it would appeal against the decision. Again, UK judge denies U.S. extradition. The United States will be appealing that decision. As far as I can tell, I want to get some guests on about this ASAP to talk about this. Where does this leave Julian Assange? We'll come back to that. The New York Times is reporting that last year, at least 136 civilians and 168 security force members were killed in targeted, unclaimed assassinations. The attacks directed at civil servants, members of the media, human rights workers, and former and current security force members represent a shift from targeted assaults on high-profile officials by the Taliban and other groups operating in the country towards civil society's rank and file and security forces who were at home with their families with responsibility for the deaths, often unclaimed, Officials blame the killings in part on the Taliban, but responsibility is also being pinned on unnamed foreign political actors seizing upon the country's political instability. The targeted killings have been primarily carried out in two ways, through gunfire and through homemade bombs, which are typically assembled using plastic high explosives and powerful magnets which allow them to be easily attached to vehicles. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break. On the other side, we will be back with our soapbox segment and Jamarl Thomas's monologue. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this on, definitely give us a like and share that audio and video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We don't bite. At the very least, we've never bit anyone that didn't deserve it, or at the very least, I haven't. We were pointing out the force of the vote stuff, and the force of the vote stuff is interesting. Just as a basis of operation, the world doesn't allow you to behave any way you want and get the exact results that you want. You always have to dance between the raindrops. You always have to work between the lines. This is just one of those factors of chess. Also, just because you want a result and just because that result might be good doesn't necessarily mean that it will turn out the way you expect it to turn out. All of these things are open. If you start off with a plan, and the plan is to try to get Medicare for all vote on the floor, that's good. That's a great thing. That's an awesome thing. There are all sorts of benefits from it, from the use of leverage and just from showing people what it looks like to be aggressive, showing that this is going to be a new standard in regards to oppositional politics. All of those things I consider to be positive. By the same token, if you start off that process in a way that is so vitriolic that it puts in roadblocks, then you can't turn around and use the propaganda that you should not pay attention to the vitriol. You should not pay attention to the other stuff. You should only pay attention to the main point. I think that's comically ridiculous because it goes against the way human beings behave in real life. The fact of the matter is both can be true. The idea could be phenomenally good. By the same token, the way it was pushed is horrendous, and the people that were willing to give a blank check, I'm sorry, did not help this process because you undermined your ultimate objective. If your objective was Medicare for all, then the vitriol undermines it. And you need to understand that while your group and your people on Twitter are totally on board for that, other people who look at that think that's appalling, even people that agree with the premise. Therein, to some degree, lies the problem. And if the left can't honestly engage that, then oh well. More importantly, then this forced the vote stuff, even though I think it's a big deal that the squad basically failed miserably to hold Pelosi accountable. And for that matter, to even show a line in the sand, giving this fig leaf of we got the pay-go order removed, missing the point that they are hostile to your intentions. So it doesn't matter that you get the pay-go removed. It's subjective in and of itself, even in the way that you're saying you got it removed. And other people will probably argue that it wasn't removed at all. What's more important right now, though, has to do with what I strongly suspect is that the Republicans at some point are going to steal an election, and Democrats are going to help them do it. There's a saying that the failure of the left is the rise of the right, meaning that institutions or countries that have had these kind of right-wing rulers take over often have a failure of the left to get going. And I think what we're seeing is something true here in the United States. You have a Democratic Party that is radically tone deaf. Your environment, in and of itself, demands, not allows, demands you to be aggressive in your politics. It demands those things. And if the public is not seeing you be aggressive in pursuit of defending and protecting that public and standing up for that public, then what is the public to do? The public, you're going to get angry. Your public is going to deface property and all of these other things because the public is not having a political outlet for its wants. And when you get a political instrument that is perfectly willing to tamp down on that public, yes, to use the public's mischief and anger, righteous indignation for its own political whims and its kind of fascist pull, yes. Right now, the Republican Party, many of them, are perfectly willing to steal an election that Donald Trump clearly, overtly, and obviously lost. Unless you believe that Brian Kemp is working with the ghosts of Hugo Chavez and the communists in order to work with Biden to steal the election from Trump, then Donald Trump is lying through his teeth. And this is just a pretext to which they're using to try to take the election results. This was shown with a back and forth, a chilling back and forth. And because I know people may look at this and say, oh, this is classic Trump. No, because there's a chilling threat here of law, not U.S. law after the destruction of law. Let's play the clip. I want you to hear what I mean by this, because he's pushing the Secretary of State in Georgia, pushing him hard over and over again. But then he starts threatening him, talking about, this is against the law and people will be held accountable and all of this other stuff. Let's play the clip. This is a longer version of the clip.
We have won this election in Georgia based on all of this. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, Brad. Having a correct, the people of Georgia are angry. And these numbers are going to be repeated on Monday night, along with others that we're going to have by that time, which are much more substantial even. And the people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
Now, do you think it's possible that they shredded ballots in Fulton County? Because that's what the rumor is. And also that Dominion took out machines. That Dominion is really moving fast to get rid of their machinery. Do you know anything about that? Because that's illegal.
This is Ryan, Germany. No, Dominion has not moved any machinery out of Fulton County. We're having.
But have they moved? Have they moved the inner parts of the machines and replaced them with other parts?
No.
You sure, Ryan?
I'm sure.
You should want to have an accurate election, and you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
No, I know you don't. No, you don't. You don't have, not even close. You're off by hundreds of thousands of votes. You know what they did, and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. But they are shredding ballots, in my opinion, based on what I've heard, and they are removing machinery, and they're moving it as fast as they can, both of which are criminal fines, and you can't let it happen, and you are letting it happen. I'm notifying you that you're letting it happen.
That's disturbing on so many levels. You know what they're doing and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. Is it a criminal offense? A criminal offense for who? Under what law? Under U.S. law, what is taking place is basically straightforward. Now, if there's a smashing and a destruction of U.S. law, and there is some other secondary law that comes into place with the Trump administration, imperial Trump administration at this point, meaning a full-blown fascist takeover of the U.S., well, yeah, it may be against his law. Meaning, if you smash the state, and anything that comes after that, that installs and instills its own law, then by definition, it will be against the law because you're creating a secondary law. Understand, law is not real. Law is basically, it's not moral, it's not just, it's not any of those things. It's just whoever's in power, whoever has the biggest gun, tells other people what to do, and those people respond by doing what they're supposed to do. Hopefully, there's some idea of fairness into it or justice built into it, especially if that law wants to withstand the test of time. The point I'm making here is Donald Trump is basically threatening the Secretary of State of Georgia, saying, hey, you are willfully breaking the law by not breaking the law. Trump has a bunch of other Republicans backing him on this escapade. Now, whether or not this succeeds, certainly you can see a problem here in the trend. You initially get Republicans refusing to give Obama his Supreme Court pick. That is a big deal. You move on to Russiagate for 3 years, where they basically screamed that the President of the United States was installed by a foreign power, going so far as to almost have a soft coup to take the President of the United States out using that pretext. Then you have a situation where the President of the United States blows off the fact that he lost the election with a bunch of other Republicans raising their hand saying, yes, we will stand side by side with Trump and attest that he actually won this election. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. Where does that go in 10 years? Where does that go in a decade? When you have somebody who's a little bit more competent, a little bit, who is more entrenched in the power structure. I don't believe that the McConnells of the world like Trump. I don't even believe that the Pences of the world like Trump. I believe that it's in their political interest to bend towards him, and so they do that. But what happens when somebody else within, let's say, like a decade win? Because Democrats believe that they don't necessarily have to attend to the needs of the public and allow basically a tone-deaf campaign. They lose. This person gets in, and the other Republicans, just like all of these Republicans right now that are basically saying, yes, we will back this person even though they lost. That comes into play, but it comes into play in a way where these people actually do have control of the power structure, where this guy is part of a structure where they actually agree with. And whereas Trump may not be able to pull this off, somebody else will. All I'm pointing out is look at the direction to which your country is going. And is this a positive step? And do you believe that the tone deafness of the Democratic Party to attend to the needs of the population, it is supposed to be the release valve to have a capitalistic system, is going to be a benefit or a hindrance to that process? Shane, what do you think? Personally, I think this is a dramatically big deal. Because they're assuming that either the structures of the system itself will stop them so they can act with impunity, or they're assuming a certain level of brinksmanship that they may be able to pull it off. And both of those are problematic positions. What do you think?
I think just desperately trying to get this thing done. And I mean, here's the thing, man. The Hugo Chavez ghost stuff is ridiculous. I was making that joke too, and I will still make that joke when it comes to Dominion. But I've heard, and we have a guest coming on later on the show, at least one of them, who might be able to make that case. That's Lee, my dad, about there is some evidence that there was voter fraud. Now, whether that was or just a general election fraud. Now, whether that was enough to swing the results of the election is a matter of some debate, even among the people who believe that there was election fraud. But I'm just saying, I don't want to conflate different cases that could be made for there having been a significant margin of fraud in this election. Not that I actually believe that there was. It doesn't seem to me like there was, but I'm trying to defend people who are saying that because I just think it's a position that should be defended. Another side of this, though, man, if this is a coup, this is like an even softer version of the coup than the Democrats tried earlier this year when they literally tried to impeach Trump on bogus charges. This is not Caesar crossing the Rubicon with like thousands of troops. This is Trump on a phone call with the Secretary of State of a state. Now, admittedly, in my opinion, he should not be pressuring him with criminal charges, but I'm just saying it's not on the same level. It's not that kind of thing. And again, the Democrats, I would say, did more than that, were more egregious and more to the point in their attempt to depose a current leader than Trump is when he's trying to prevent Biden from stepping into the office. I don't like it. I don't like any of it. It's all a degradation of our political system and, the system like you've been talking about, like we've been talking about, the system of succession in American presidencies. So it's not good for any of that, but I would caution against being so strident. Anyway, we're going into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. More, I'm sure, on this topic later. For now, though, we'll be back in just a minute on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Niko House, political activist and broadcast journalist and the founder of CEO and MCSC Network. Niko, what's going on?
Hey, gentlemen, thanks for having me.
No, man, of course. So, the big news this morning, I woke up to a big splashy headline on my Twitter thing. Assange extradition denied. Now,
I know.
I dealt with it. I saw that with all sorts of melancholy. I couldn't celebrate because my thought was, this man has been in prison for 7 years in an embassy, after which he was stuck in a jail cell for like a year and a half as a political prisoner, as a literal political prisoner. He was right about that there was a warrant that the United States was trying to get him. He was right about all that stuff. In fact, the entire reason he went into the embassy was he was trying to avoid what he knew was a political prisoner, a political witch hunt against him. And now the judge is like, yeah, I'm blowing off all the journalism stuff. I just don't want him to off himself. As if the judge was just looking for any excuse to let him go. That's what it comes across as. Like what it seems as if the judge seems to be pressured on this idea of letting him go as a journalist, which he literally is. And so she comes up with the idea that, he'll kill himself in American jails. That seems like a fig leaf of an excuse. How did you view all of this? You were covering this case as much as I was.
Well, to be honest with you, I don't care what the excuse is at this point. As long as they get that man out. Obviously, as we know, it's bigger than just Julian Assange. Just is a matter of freedom of the press, and because they don't want. This whole thing was meant to make the press feel unsafe in telling the truth. They don't want to get rid of that feeling of fear that they just tried. They spent years instilling via Julian Assange's persecution, but. I think they know. You had WikiLeaks released a graphic yesterday showing that even the Washington Post and New York Times were against extradition. It was when I saw that was like, I was like, wow, okay. we might actually see some good stuff happen tomorrow. Well, I said this yesterday, and woke up to the good news, and so I'm just happy that he's free, or he will be free soon enough.
It's exciting. No, it's very good, and it's weird to see this again. Weird to see this coming from the UK, especially with all the waves in the US recently. I mean, waves on both sides of the Atlantic, but like rumors that Trump was considering a pardon with Giuliani and Palin coming out. Just interesting times to be living in, and glad that this is finally happening. Anyway, Niko, changing topics slightly. Nancy Pelosi being reelected as Speaker of the House. This comes after weeks of pressure from progressives, from the Force the Vote movement. I'm curious, what are your thoughts, having seen this?
That was a wild ride yesterday. It looked like there were a few different factions of the Democratic Party that had different reasons for initially not voting for her. But I think that like AOC was probably just putting on the show as she usually does. I think that Cori Bush is probably legitimately on the fence. I think Hakeem Jeffries is actually trying to commit a coup. Two other representatives from that area ended up abstaining or voting for him, which was random. And yet, because of almost 50 or so abstentions, McCarthy actually won. And that's the part that people aren't discussing. They ended up having, because of parliamentary procedure, having to go back and then recounting the abstentions. And that's why the threshold got moved back up to about 214. But initially, because of all the abstentions, McCarthy did outright win. And then they went back into the abstentions, which ended up obviously leading to Pelosi's victory. But I think that a bunch of Democrats may have been biting off more than they could chew, at least by their party standards. and then when they realized they were doing the math, they're like, uh-oh, hold up. I don't think this is supposed to happen. So there is probably an amendment that a lot of people have to be making. There was a lot of people that thought there was no way in hell McCarthy could win, just because of the math. We didn't think the math could possibly work out in his favor to that degree. And it almost did yesterday. And that's what the Democrats ended up changing their mind, because they're like, whoa, we weren't expecting this. So, but, we got screwed again. What a surprise.
The vote ended up being 212 for Pelosi, 204 for McCarthy, 2 others, 3 present or voting present. The wild part about this is that initially it seemed that Cori Bush didn't vote for Pelosi. And initially it seemed like AOC didn't vote for Pelosi. But like you say, eventually they came back and had to make the vote. And they eventually, all of them, voted for Pelosi on this front. Bowman and Cori Bush, who are coming in, because you're a freshman, I give a little bit of leeway to that, because you have other members of the squad and they may be able to talk you into, hey, let's do this incrementalism stuff and we're going to do, so fair enough. But kind of not. I mean, when they were asked once before, are you going to back the force to vote stuff? Or are you going to back Pelosi? And what did Bowman? Bowman was like, well, it depends on whether or not they back Medicare for all and reparations, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens? Pay-go. A tweak to pay-go. And they were bragging as if this tweak to pay-go was sufficient. Whether they realize it or not, holding Pelosi, holding this particular vote hostage, meaning the force to vote, pay-go is not adequate. It's just not. And this is kind of the problem that people, that's the Democratic problem in and of itself. The incrementalism stuff in lieu of actual policy that is demanded. I mean, for God's sake, it wasn't just allowed for them to push Pelosi. It was demanded. What do you think about that? I mean, because to me, I look at this and say, they needed to put a line in the sand that this is not going to be the same go along to get along. And they seem completely incapable of doing that. And what do you think this means for the squad going forward this year? I mean, is this going to be theatrics without the actual laying down on policy?
I mean, I'm sure you saw yesterday that for the first time, and this is what a crazy way to start 2021, but the fraud squad was trending #1 on Twitter for most of the night last night, which means the world was watching. They were also expecting more out of them, and that's including Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, especially because after the big talk that they talked.
and they didn't deliver again. And once actually AOC, I think earlier that day, tweeted something about PAYGO, like, these are the concessions that we need. People don't understand that policy is actually about procedure. That's how we get things done. I'm like, oh, okay, so she's already coming up with an excuse to vote for Pelosi. I don't know why, because she already told us that she was voting for Pelosi. But you knew that she was going to pretend as if they got these massive concessions. But I knew when it came down to it, there's going to be Republicans and Trump is bad, and that's why we had to do with da-da-da-da. And of course, that's exactly what she did. She immediately went to Trump bad when the reporter asked her why. She ultimately switched her vote. Republicans are committing a coup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, we already seen this channel before. It's just another this episode before. It's just another rerun from AOC and the squad. But this time, people aren't. They don't care. They're like, I don't want to hear that Trump bad anymore. It was the difference between McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi so great that you had to sacrifice your integrity by voting for a woman who's denying a vote on Medicare for all in the middle of a pandemic? The answer is no. There is basically no difference between them in that regard. And so that's why I think America, that was just the last straw. They happened to catch the perfect storm of everyone paying attention for various reasons, and they dropped the ball big on this one.
So where do progressives go? I mean, the squad and the progressive caucus were as close, specifically the squad, as close as I could see inside the political system to a genuine alternative for people with, progressive opinions outside of the political system. But with this seems to be driving a serious wedge between the public and their nominal representatives, even if there's just a small wing of Congress overall. But where do you think the public can go at this point, Niko?
To be honest, I'm out here in D.C. right now with people like Jackson Hinkle, the Convo Couch crew with Pete Potts and Johnny, Action for Assange crew is out here. Lee Camp showed up yesterday, Max Blumenthal, Bree Joy Gray. There's no more waiting for politicians. That whole idea that we can vote these people out and that'll solve our problems. You tried voting these people out. You voted a few of them in, and they just threw you under the bus yesterday. People have to get up off their couch and do whatever they can using direct action, like we've been seeing over the last couple of days. Clearly, there was a monkey wrench thrown in a lot of people's plans yesterday, and it almost led to something that ended up with McCarthy winning, even though Nancy Pelosi at that point was guaranteed to vote. And so the little steps, the baby steps here and there, and of course, it's not going to be like a thing that happens today or tomorrow or maybe even next week, but Assange is free. He's about to be let go. That's from organizing. That's from fighting. That's from people spending the Action for Assange crew every single week for about 15 weeks. Or excuse me, I think it's 115 weeks straight. Basically, they over the last couple of years, they've done these vigils every single week and organized and traveled to Europe to cover the hearings. They're here right now. They've been up since 4 o'clock in the morning covering the readings. These type of direct actions, not relying on electoral politics and electoralism, but using your pressure as a voter and as a voice to then sway public opinion to force politicians to do what they don't want to do. That's the only way we're going to get this stuff done. We have to stop solely relying on electoral politics and get out there.
I mean, is Assange really a case of that? I mean, I feel you. I mean, a lot of energy was expended, and I don't want to undermine, and I don't want to even come across as if I'm trying to undermine the amount of energy that people were expending trying to push for Assange. But like I said, I greet this with all sorts of melancholy. The entire point of what took place to Assange wasn't just to the legal proceeding of it. In fact, the legal aspect of it was a fig leaf. The feature was the torture. I mean, the entire point was to see Assange torture in public when everybody can see it. So everybody can see, basically, this is no different than them hanging somebody and leaving the body up for 5 days so the public knows, don't do this. Don't tread in this particular direction. That basically was the entire point of the torturing of Assange for all that time. Either the mental torture when he was there, the keeping him in the embassy, all of that stuff. And then putting him in prison after that, putting him in Belmarsh, having him in uncomfortable conditions, dangerous conditions from the standpoint of his health and injury. I would point out that I think the entire point was the torture, not the legal part. Let's hit you when we come back. So let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice you guys are listening to is Niko House, political activist and broadcaster journalist and founder and CEO of MCSC Network. You can follow Niko on Twitter at NikoCSFB. You can follow Mikasa Sukasa Network on Twitter at MCSC Network and watch their videos on YouTube by searching MCSC Network with Niko. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. Joining us is Niko House, political activist and broadcaster journalist and founder and CEO of MCSC Network. Niko, before we take the break, I asked you whether or not it was... Look, my point of view of government basically boils down to stuff like this, that the point is to torture, that the legal means or the legal process is the secondary, that the point is for 7 years, put him somewhere where the public can watch him basically wither on the vine, where you could show this is what happens to people that trespass against the state. Do the same thing again when he's in prison. And whether or not Assange is released or whether or not Assange is extradited, both of those things end up being the exact same thing because the penalty has already been shown. How do you view that? I mean, it seems like the mission has been accomplished, whether Assange was released or not. And I think that's the most, debilitating thing to me in viewing this. How do you view this?
Well, I wouldn't say that's the only reason, but I agree with you. That's a huge part of it, right? It's to show that, even a person with this much clout can be treated like this. However, there is absolutely still a legal component to this because they want to be able, like they had to try and legalize torture through policy before they engaged in some of the ramping up of torture that we saw during the Afghanistan war and the war in Iraq. Like, they go through this, they could, they will snatch up a body quick. Our country has had no problem with doing that. Sometimes it ain't the courts that come and arrest you. It's some guy with a beard dressed in all black carrying an M4 with a flashlight. And you'll never see your family again and they'll never know. Just like there are a bunch of people locked up in Guantanamo Bay right now that a lot of them were proven innocent and they're still there. Nobody knows who they are. We never heard about their trial, saw their trial. So like they want to be able to get away with doing the things that they've done to Julian Assange. And you don't go out of way to extradite somebody like that without wanting some type of tangible precedent set in the court system that would maybe stop or make people reconsider engaging in any type of, in this case, journalism that could potentially hurt the U.S. empire. So I do agree with you that was largely the goal, for sure. But I think that they did want to put the stamp on that by saying, and we will get you back to the U.S. You're not safe anywhere in the world. And all these governments will comply with us because we have that much power. And what we saw, at least, until we see the results of the appeal, which I imagine won't work because there's just not a strong enough case. They didn't have a strong enough case to begin with. But at least until we see the result of that, we just witnessed that there was so much public pressure there. They're like, look, we got to let him go. We can maybe appease the U.S. by saying we won't, set the precedent that that journalism must be protected and freedom of press must be protected. But we got to come up with something, because this ain't going to fly, especially when you now have mainstream media and establishment coming out like, look, we don't like the guy either, but come on, y'all are setting us up for failure here. And so
that's right there. I mean, that's what it seemed like, right? I mean, because was it Washington Post or something came out with like an op-ed saying, hey, maybe our head will be on the line if you do this.
Washington Post and New York Times.
Yeah, Rachel Maddow, who hates
Washington
the guy.
Post and New York Times, yeah.
And came out with an article. I came out with a thing saying, hey, maybe this is a bad idea. I know you don't like Assange, but maybe this is a bad idea. Yeah, all of these guys. It looks like the judge was just looking for any excuse that she could to let him go. And he'll kill himself if he goes to American jails. That just seems like such a out of the blue, weird, awkward way of letting him out. Shane, how did you see that? I don't think I've asked you about that, or we talked about it. The odd way in which the excuse that she's using to let him out. Not he's a journalist. Not if the United States should not be able to go after a publicist, if not allowing the publicist to be held also and protected by those laws. Meaning, we can get you with our laws, but you can't be protected by our laws. Like, how do you view this and the breakdown of this and the way that this turned out, and even the way the judge is like, okay, well, he's going to commit suicide. Not he's a publisher. Meaning the arguments that they gave and everything else didn't matter. She ended up on something that just seems to be something different.
Well, that means that the arguments did matter. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're right, because that was actually a huge part of it was Assange's deteriorating health, but which is ironic, and I hate to even say this. I know that Julian Assange has displayed an incredible amount of strength and has really made it clear, at least recently, that he's seeing this thing through, and he's been fighting for his life to get through this. And I don't think there was any inclination that he was going to commit suicide, maybe literally die in jail, because they were setting him up to be killed. Even going out of their way to move COVID patients into his wing and not give him a mask. Obviously, he hasn't been vaccinated in any sense. They're not, his diet is trash. So they were trying to kill him. But the man fought through, and he fought through to see at least this small victory until we can once again see the outcome of the appeal. But this is something, in my opinion, without question, we celebrated. That everything that you said is true, Jamarl. But at the end of the day, if there was a deliberation behind closed doors, that they even were like, hey, this might be a step too far, which is why we might have saw earlier, a couple of years ago, after the Chelsea Manning debacle, the grand jury that was created for WikiLeaks was disbanded. And when I saw that, I was thinking like, wow, maybe this ain't going to work out how a lot of the empire thinks it's going to. I have some skeptical optimism. But even with this Facebook lawsuit, seeing 48 states jump in with the current U.S. State Department suing Facebook, we're finding out now that they actually have proof in employee testimony where basically Facebook was using its monopoly status to literally suppress other apps from engaging with it if they have any of the same features. And like for 48 states, Democrat and Republicans, who all have their separate reasons for disliking Facebook right now, and once again working with and alongside the Trump State Department to get it done, we're seeing some very surprising outcomes lately, by hook or by crook, but nonetheless, surprisingly positive outcomes lately. And I think you would agree, a lot of people who have been bad actors are also getting exposed simultaneously, and so I think overall we are seeing a paradigm shift. And ultimately, I think this is great. Regardless of what their reason was, we know that if Washington Post and New York Times came out, we know that they were ultimately forced to acquiesce to the establishment parties that may have been affected. And once again, you got to be loud enough about that. Even you got to be loud if you can, as an activist, about that. to let the establishment know, hey, I don't know if your boss is telling you, but your job might be on the line too if you're not careful. And I think that was well received by the judge. And even though they couldn't use that as an excuse to set precedents, through their opinion, Assange is free. And that's, or he should be free, I should say, here pretty soon. And that work in and of itself is absolutely worth celebrating, regardless of the reason why.
One of the weird ways in which she did this is she made it about his autism. I'm going to quote here again, Mr. Assange's mental health would deteriorate, causing him to commit suicide with the single-minded determination of his autism spectrum disorder, end quote. Just a kind of out of left field, weird way to focus on this. You're not going to make it about the 7 years of detention like you're talking about, the ongoing psychological torture, et cetera. It's about his own personality trait or quirks or whatever. Just another side of this, another way of looking at this, I would say, is when Obama pardoned Chelsea Manning, he pardoned the other side of the crime that was being committed. Now, he didn't pardon Assange at the time, didn't do anything to on that front. I think part of what that has to do with was back in early 2017, late 2016, and from then on to this day, the massive anti-Russian propaganda campaign that's been going on with Russiagate, with everything else, where what they did was during the election cycle in 2016, they tied Assange at the waist to Russia, sort of from an informational perspective. And you're talking about, and the majority of states going after Facebook, similar lawsuits against Google. It's like cracks in the informational edifice of the American state are showing up and they're widening. And I'm very curious. I think Jamarl's right. That, in some sense, a lot of the damage has already been done by cautioning other purveyors of information from coming out. Other people who might try to act in a capacity like WikiLeaks, other genuine whistleblowers. But serious damage is being done and has been done. So I'm curious, Niko, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on the Russia element to this? And what are your thoughts? You brought up Facebook. What are your thoughts on the future of information? Looking forward to it.
So I actually agree with you. And I'll to correct it, he didn't pardon Manning. Obama didn't pardon Manning. He just granted her clemency for which doesn't forgive the crimes.
Thank you.
But it just changes the sentence and all that good stuff and allows her to go free earlier. And that was, simultaneously, like you said, that was ignoring the fact that Chelsea Manning, while they were simultaneously prosecuting Julian Assange and freeing her, she was working with Julian Assange, and that's why she was there. She was in prison. And so they wanted to make sure that people who didn't feel like it was okay to work with Julian Assange, but to a large degree they didn't know that they couldn't kind of keep up this habit of prosecuting everybody who went to WikiLeaks, especially given, like you said, this almost like this. There's so many cracks in ability to get information that are exposed, and you're going to find yourself in a little bit of a debacle trying to stop everybody from getting information on Julian Assange or WikiLeaks. Even now, WikiLeaks is still able to get information about OPCW reports and things like that. So I think that you're right. Same thing happened, right? Even recently with Chelsea Manning with the grand jury for WikiLeaks. They did torture her. They did, arrest her, but and they came up with a BS excuse as to why they let her go. But they did let her go, and they ended up disbanding that grand jury, and it's not here anymore. So they gave us some BS reason because they don't want us to know the real reason why. But it's funny because it seems like at times, once again, at times, our Constitution is so strong whenever public opinion and the public awareness is focused on a particular subject that even if it's in the shadows, sometimes it has to be upheld because they don't want the domino effect. Because let's be real, a lot of the crimes, the oligarchical crimes that have been committed in this country have been done behind the Constitution, right? The legality of it is what makes it so dangerous. Yeah. So at that point, I know it's twisted, but at that point, they even have to protect the Constitution, much to their chagrin at times. And I'm sure this is one of those times.
Yeah. If you want to keep the system going, you got to protect the system in a weird way. Like it's so strange. One last point. You got about 30 seconds. What do you think is going to happen to WikiLeaks after this? I mean, it seems that WikiLeaks slowed down tremendously. And some people thought that maybe because Assange was being basically tortured, that he might have been releasing data or might have been exposing information, that type of stuff. So they wasn't sure if that was a reason why WikiLeaks was slowing down. What do you think happens to WikiLeaks after this? What do you think happens to Assange after this if they let him go? You have about 30 seconds.
Given Assange's history, I think he ramps it up. To be honest with you, I don't think he's going to slow down. I think WikiLeaks and Assange, they're more dedicated than their own individual safety from every inclination that I've gotten and seen. So I think that they're not going to slow down, but
they're going to ramp it up.
You know, we need it.
The voice you guys have been listening to is Niko House, political activist and broadcast journalist and founder of CEO and MCSC Network. You can follow Niko on Twitter at NikoCSFB. Follow the Mikasa Sukasa Network on Twitter at MCSC Network and watch their videos on YouTube by searching MCSC Network with Niko House. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 2,373 new coronavirus deaths and 291,384 new cases were reported in the United States on January 2nd. At least 1,353 new coronavirus deaths and 201,476 new cases were reported in the United States on January 3rd. Over the past week, there's been an average of 205,840 cases per day, a decrease of 5% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Sunday evening, more than 20,661,700 people in the United States have been infected from the coronavirus, and approximately 351,000 have died from it. Wow. More than 4.2 million people in the United States have received a dose of the coronavirus COVID-19 vaccine, all according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, falling short of the goal federal officials set to give at least 20 million people their first shots before the end of December. The federal government said Saturday that it had delivered more than 13 million doses to states, territories, and federal agencies, but federal health officials have recently said the vaccine rollout has been slower than expected, acknowledging that they lack a clear understanding as to why only a small portion of the doses have shipped across the nation have been administered. India has formally approved the emergency use of 2 coronavirus vaccines, those coming from AstraZeneca with Oxford University and from local Bharat Biotech, as it prepares for one of the world's biggest inoculation drives. India, which makes about 60% of the vaccines globally, plan to immunize about 300 million people by July 2021. India has also announced it would not allow the export of Oxford University AstraZeneca coronavirus for several months, according to the head of the Serum Institute for India, which has been contracted to make 1 billion doses of the vaccine for developing nations. As a result, the export of the vaccines to developing nations, part of COVAX, won't begin until March or April. 2 weeks into the vaccination campaign, Israel is administering more than 150,000 doses a day, with a total batch of initial shots amounting to more than 1 million of its 9 million citizens, a higher proportion of the population than anywhere else. But one massive group is being left out of the rollout. Israel is transporting batches of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine deep into the West Bank, but only to be distributed to Jewish settlers, not the roughly 2.7 million Palestinians living there, who may have to wait weeks or months. The Palestinian Authority is rushing to get its own vaccines, although, when asked for a timeline, the Director General of the Palestinian Health Ministry estimated the first vaccines probably will not arrive until February. Shane, this is interesting to me on several levels. Israel has Palestine in an open-air ghetto. They bombed Palestine. They even bombed them for Christmas. When they killed, 2,200 of them, I think this was a few years ago, the world basically watched, and there were like little to no consequences for them doing that. Food, resources, all of those things are held up trying to get into those areas. Why would this be any different? And I say the same thing about the rest of the world. The majority of the planet makes like $10 or less a day, with a large segment of it making $2 or less a day. This group is often left out of things like food, building materials, and drugs. So you have something like this of a COVID-19, you have a pandemic, all of these people are affected. Why are we pretending as if the world is somehow fair, that the poor areas are gonna also get it in the same way as the wealthy areas, when that's not typically the way it works for either food, materials, resources, or for that matter, even living situations? Like, why are we pretending? Why the fake belief? Why not just have reality the way reality is? And just say, look, in real terms, the poor are often left to die. They are often left on the margins where they don't get the food and the medical necessity that they need. Why are we going to pretend that the COVID-19 makes this different? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, clearly, I want all of these people to get the health care. Clearly, I don't want people living off $10 a day, because they don't need to live off $10 a day. We have trillions of dollars that are basically held in these kind of camps off the side of the coast. I'm making somewhat of a different point. Why are we pretending? Why are we acting as if this is a fair, generous world? We allow people to fall off the margins constantly. That is the basis of our society if you're going to make an honest thing about capitalism. I mean, in order for you to get that 1%, you have to need that people squalling, at the bottom in order to make that work, even in the context of the U.S. I mean, we only represent 5% of the world's population. What do you think about it? Why the pretense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Does it, am I making sense?
You are. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Well, because there are a couple of sides to this. For one thing, there has been legitimate, substantial progress, at least on some fronts, over the course of the last couple of centuries. Certainly technologically, in terms of what we're capable of, and we see that being applied, and so we're like, okay, things are getting better. That's not necessarily true, but that you can definitely make that argument, and a lot of people do, and so you hear that, and it's comforting, to spread that, and so you hear that being spread. But on the other hand, because we're idealistic and because our civilization is built on certain ideals, at least on, the ostensible fulfillment of those ideals, and in order to keep the ship together, in order to keep the planet floating around the sun, our like ordered universe together, we sort of convince ourselves that we would do those things, even while on a day-to-day basis, we often don't. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I guess my point is idealism in this way lies. Like the notion of being, like for example, how do you be impartial reporting about slavery? And can you be impartial about it? And if you're impartial about people being enslaved or about Native Americans being killed and shot, is it somehow unfair to the Native Americans that you're trying to be fair to the pilgrims that are killing them? I'm saying the same thing is kind of true here. The idealism of it hides a gross reality of things. And that maybe if you didn't have the idealism, the gross reality will spur people to act in ways that they should have acted in the beginning. Meaning the idealism glosses over a lot of stuff that it shouldn't gloss over. And the very fact that that idealism is there, or it's not even idealism, it's more like projection more than anything else. I understand your point. It's like nobody wants to deal with the reality of that stuff in real terms. But I'm making the point that in dealing with it in real terms, you may have a better chance of actually fixing these elements of your society. But I think your point would probably be they don't want to fix those areas of society. They want to keep it the way it is. Hence, the idealism and the projection. Am I wrong?
No. No. I mean, fundamentally, we agree on that. But then there's this question of whether you could have a society without certain ideals or what ideals even are. I guess part of it is like an ideally is something that you live up to. It's not something that you assume that you already have. But there's also this question of who exactly is responsible for it. And when one of the problems, of course, with responsibility is that when it is widely distributed, it's often ignored. It's often, if everybody's at fault for something, or if a fairly large number of people are at fault for something, they can each sort of shuffle around, throw the ambiguous moral hot potato from one to the other until it effectively doesn't exist. And
somebody else's job
what goes on here.
Yeah, it's like that guy's job. It's not my job. It's the anonymous violence. It's like this. The anonymity of his state allows this kind of, the person to be left on the outskirts, on the margins, without anybody necessarily taking responsibility for the fact that the person is left on the margins. I would argue that's the issue of state, because it's not the responsibility of any particular individual per se. So I would imagine it has to fall under the purview of state. But yeah, I'm always bothered by that because I don't like the lie. That's the prevailing lie. That, hey, these vaccines should go out to everybody equally. Yeah, it should. But our resources under normal circumstances don't. But let's keep going. A growing number of Republican senators, led by Ted Cruz, announced on Saturday that they would object to certifying state electoral college votes on Wednesday and call for resurrecting of the Electoral Commission to conduct an emergency audit of the results. In a statement released Saturday, the senators and senators elected call for Congress to, quote, appoint an electoral commission with full investigatory and fact-finding authority to conduct an emergency 10-day audit of the election returns in the disputed states, unquote. This comes as House and Senate are set to meet Wednesday for a joint session in which the individual electoral college counts from each state are announced. President Trump pressured Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to, quote, find, unquote, him enough votes to overturn the presidential election and vaguely threaten him with a criminal offense, quote unquote, during an hour-long phone call on Saturday, according to an audio recording of the conversation obtained by the Washington Post. We'll be coming, we spoke about this in the monologue, but we have a short audio clip. Let's play a small version of this just so you can get a hint of what this conversation was.
We have won this election in Georgia based on all of this. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, Brad. Having a correct. The people of Georgia are angry, and these numbers are going to be repeated on Monday night, along with others that we're going to have by that time, which are much more substantial even. And the people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. That you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
Yeah, the data you have is wrong. And the very fact that they believed that he took this audio, meaning they understood where Donald Trump was coming from. They understood Donald Trump couldn't be trusted. Donald Trump goes on Twitter and basically says, I spoke with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as, quote, ballots under the table, unquote, scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. Now, this is what Trump ended up writing on Twitter. So the release of this audio basically contradicts everything Donald Trump said in that tweet, and you got to hear it for yourself. And the fact that he took that audio got across that he didn't trust the person that he was talking to, especially with you using the ghost of Chavez. The thing that I was trying to point out, or the ghost of, Hugo Chavez. The thing I was trying to point out in the monologue wasn't so much that Donald Trump was going to be successful in pulling this off. My point was that the trend that we're going in this country seems to be in this direction of a fascist takeover. It doesn't have to be this one. Look at the trend lines. I mean, you basically have a bunch of Republicans with a fig leaf of nothing, basically saying, yes, we're going to back Donald Trump up and trying to basically steal the election. Again, either they believe that the infrastructure of the state won't allow them to do it, and that this level of brinksmanship, basically, they can do this because they won't necessarily ever be allowed to go through with it. Or they believe it potentially will work. Both of those situations are problematic. Not, again, necessarily at this very specific moment, but give it a decade and look at some of the other things that have come about in our world. As of Sunday evening, all 10 defense secretaries have released an opinion piece in the Washington Post in which they caution acting Defense Secretary Mark Esper and his staff to, quote, refrain from any political actions that undermine the results of the election or hinder the success of the new team, unquote, saying that, quote, efforts to involve the U.S. Armed Forces in resolving election disputes would take us into dangerous, unlawful, unconstitutional territory, unquote. That is an understatement. That is an understatement. Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker of the House for the 117th Congress, clinching the gavel for the 4th time as she now prepares to steal sharply divided chamber through the final turbulent days of the Trump era. This comes after weeks of concerted pushback from a wing of progressives calling on members of the Progressive Caucus to withhold their votes for Pelosi's re-election as Speaker unless she pushes for a vote on Medicare for all. This, sadly, was a failure as every member of the squad voted for one Miss Pelosi. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And just to get this one in before we go real quick, UK District Judge Vanessa Barrister has ruled to reject the U.S. request to extradite WikiLeaks founder and whistleblower Julian Assange. Barrister indicated that the extradition would have a harmful effect on Assange's mental health and said she ruled against the U.S. request due to fears that the whistleblower has a high risk of committing suicide as a result. In her ruling, Barrister wrote, quote, I accept that oppression as a bar to extradition requires a high threshold. However, I am satisfied that in these harsh conditions, Mr. Assange's mental health would deteriorate, causing him to commit suicide with the single-minded determination, unquote, of his autism spectrum disorder. The United States said it would appeal against the decision. Again, a very weird reason to let him go. His autism would make it uniquely likely that he would commit suicide and overcome pretty much any condition that the United States put up to prevent him from committing suicide. This is an extraordinary, out of left field ruling, but I'll take it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Now, one of my favorite guests, and they always say when I talk about UFOs, I seem like a younger man, so I'm going to seem like I'm 10 years younger. Tom Whitmore. Tom Whitmore is joining us. Tom Whitmore is a former financial analyst and currently a senior board member of MUFON, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization composed of civilian volunteers who study reported UFO sightings. It's one of the oldest and largest organizations of its kind, claiming more than 4,000 members worldwide. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jamarl. Good morning.
Absolutely. So, the UAP task force has been passed, meaning this is going to be the law of the land now, where Congress officially, the reason that I'm telling people that this is such a big deal is because this is not behind the scenes. Like, if I've made this example before about the difference between something overt and implicit. If you're over my house and you say, oh, this is an interesting meal. Well, you don't like the meal, but you're not overtly saying you hate the meal. If you come on and say, this is horrible, that's different, even though you basically said the same thing. The tone of it, the overtness of it makes it different, more explicit. Well, the same thing is true about this. The U.S. military might have been studying UFOs for a period of time in these kind of black budget projects, but it's different for it not to be a black budget project, but for the Army to be working with Academy, to the Stars Academy, based on some kind of material research, where the Navy has basically opened up to allow people to record their sightings, where you have a pipeline where it seems like the FBI and many of these other agencies of the government are going to explicitly send information to Congress about unidentified flying objects or UAPs. Even Brennan was asked about this, and even Brennan makes the statement talking about people have this narrow idea of life and that we're the only thing in the universe, etc., etc. It seems that the world has changed all at once. Now, how do you see this? Because again, you've been long suffering in this field. And for people who haven't been in the field, they don't know the burden. Like basically pushing, saying this is legit, this is a big deal, and for the public to basically turn their head and not entirely pay attention. And then all of a sudden, seemingly all at once, bam, legitimacy. And not just legitimacy of the state for this issue. What do you think about this? How do you feel about all of this that has been taking place? And do you look at this with a certain degree of concern?
Jamarl, I see it definitely as progress. The UFO community is very excited about this development, and it's getting a certain amount of press and definitely a lot of discussion on the UFO websites. And I think that at this point, I advise caution. I think that we should wait and see what report, if any, is produced by the UAP task force. It's possible that they could produce a report before the 180-day guideline, or it's possible that they may produce a report at that time, or they may be delayed. Maybe they are not able to get the report together. Now, my understanding is that the directive that's in the language from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence is not the force of law. What it is it's a direction. It's a request, and it's possible, even though I don't think it's likely, that the Pentagon could just ignore it. Now, I don't think they are going to ignore it because they have produced this UAP task force.
Well, and they produce videos.
I think whatever happens, whether we receive a report or what's in the report, it will be interesting. We're going to learn something.
Well, that's the catch. That's assuming they even put it out. I mean, I got to be honest, Tom. This seems like, it's like we're in the shadows of the shadows. Like, it's like we don't know what we don't know what we don't know. Under normal circumstances, what takes place in the military is like a black budget. And now this is going to be the black budget of the black budget of sorts. And we basically can only get what they give us. And we don't even know, like, the context of what they're giving us. Like, I don't know. I guess it's funny. I am happy about this. But I think my cynicism is starting to creep in. My concern is that this is coming through intelligence and military. And what does that mean in the context of how our government is viewing this issue? That's my concern, that this is cut through that lens. And is it being used under this notion of threat? And what does it mean in that context from the standpoint of how we respond to that if information is coming out to Congress, whether they release it to us or not? Does that give you any pause or any concern, or you don't you don't think that that's an issue per se?
I think there are two sides to it, Jamarl. One side is that the government, and particularly the military and intelligence agencies, have a tremendous amount of data. They have satellites, they have signals intelligence in all kinds of ways that they can collect data. Now, we on the UFO side, we want to believe that whatever it is that they're picking up is anomalous, possibly even extraterrestrial. But from the government side, their main concern is that they don't disclose anything that could give our adversaries information that they don't want them to have. So I think that the information that we're going to get, and it's perilous to make a prediction, but I wouldn't be surprised if the information that does become public is relatively bland. Now that's not to say that privately, on a confidential basis, that the Senate Select Intelligence Committee and the House side may receive classified briefings in private.
Tom, I'm curious. Actually, I want to go back. Jamarl mentioned in his last question of videos, these are a couple years old at this point, but these were released by the New York Times through, by To the Stars Academy through the New York Times. A series of videos, at least 3 that I saw, like Go Fast and Gimbal. Anyway, these videos of sightings taken from military footage, on board aircraft, basically. It's gray and black and white, gray footage, but you can hear the audio of the pilots speaking to each other about what they're seeing, and they seem astonished and shocked. Anyway, people can go check those out if they want to. I'm just curious, how significant were those? Like, it seems like those were the most significant developments in legitimizing the movement on UFO information that have come out ever, basically. I mean, I'm a novice to this stuff, but it seems like those were incredibly significant. How significant were those? What did those bring to the table that weren't previously on the table when it came to palatable discussion on this topic? Tom.
Hi, Shane. Yes, I think they're very significant. And like I said, it's progress. There has been progress. We have moved forward. But I think that we have to look at the way these things are happening. And the videos that we have seen, which are very short, the videos that we have seen were basically brought to the public through sleight of hand, because Christopher Mellon, who's a very knowledgeable person about how the government works, was able to get this material out. And there's much more to those films that we will probably never see, because the military, like I said before, does not want our adversaries to pick up too much data from them. But overall, yes, the release of those videos is very significant, and it's progress for the UFO field.
I think the key word is legitimacy. I think that's what it is. I mean, because it was released by the Pentagon. It was multiple videos. The Pentagon legitimized that, yeah, these are from us, and it going so far as to release them later on themselves. You had the military personnel from those aircraft coming out, doing interviews, basically having conversations saying, yes, I was in the air with this for X number of minutes. It looked like a piece of technology. It left me like I was standing still, etc. That pilot goes to talk to Bob Lazar, because of what Bob Lazar was saying, and then the descriptions that Bob Lazar was giving matched up basically. Like, this was phenomenal. Like, Luis Elizondo coming out of the shadows, basically telling the CNN, what's her name? I can't think of her name. But basically, yes, I think we're being visited based on my scientific research and information. Because like you said, what we saw was a fraction of what Luis Elizondo has at his hands. I mean, Luis has basically been talking about the equations that the ships use to fly on, that we have, and we've been able to model the physics of it. Like, he's been saying some pretty wild stuff since leaving working with the government. You keep mentioning other countries. I am really curious about this. So France and Britain opened up their files before the United States did, including having pilots coming out giving testimony and whatnot. What about Russia and China? they have to have
Russia is a fascinating
right?
case.
I
know.
I mean, for the size of their landmass, for the number of people, for the size of the government and everything else, they have to have as much experience with the stuff as we do, at the very least paying attention to it on some level. What do you think about it? We have about 30 seconds. What do you think about the other countries' pursuit of this?
Some of the other countries have been more forthcoming with information. I'm thinking of Spain and Brazil. I think some of the most significant activity historically has been occurring in South America, Jamarl. And for people that are interested in the UFO field, if you're looking for unusual information and very interesting information, I would look to South America. And like you say, Russia is so big, and there have been indications that the Russians have had their UFO investigation program as well. So I know Jacques Vallée had been over there several times and checked into some information, and there had been correspondence between UFO investigators here in the United States and between Russia.
Tom, anytime you want to come on the show, man, I've always enjoyed these conversations. The voice you guys have been listening to is Tom Whitmore, former financial analyst and currently a senior board member of MUFON, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization composed of civilian volunteers who study reported UFO sightings. It's one of the oldest and largest organizations of its kind, claiming more than 4,000 members worldwide. You can follow Tom on Twitter at Tom Tulsa and on his blog, Tom Whitmore blog.wordpress.com, and follow MUFON on Twitter at MUFON. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us, Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudential, Black America, and the Presidents. Margaret, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year back at you. So I follow you on Twitter. You're an avid Twitterer. I think I can say that accurately. And
I am, yes.
Well, I was watching one of the things I've been following events that have taken place. Like, for example, the fall of the Soviet Union happening on Christmas, and then talking about it kind of on the show, and this basically connecting history to current events. Well, similar with the Haitian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution that basically took place around the first of the year. And so I wanted to get the opportunity to basically discuss it and talk about it, especially the consequences. Because this kind of goes to the conversation about Assange, that sometimes the legal process that you're seeing is secondary to the main point of torturing and punishing the individual that is the temerity to push back against empire or state. And Assange just so happened to be the latest instance of that. But this has taken place over the course of time, including pushing back against various revolutions, whether that's Iran pushing back against the revolution in the United States, where the United States basically had a coup and took over the country and they had a revolution back, or Haiti, or Cuba. So let's start with Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, this was in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that? Because this is like one of the first revolutions, if I'm not mistaken, the first that was successful against this kind of empire. Please discuss this one. I want to delve into it once you start.
Okay. Yeah, Haiti, thanks so much for having me back. Haiti was one of France's most prosperous colonies, that is to say, based on enslavement. The free labor of enslaved people built France's wealth. France had colonies in the Caribbean. Aside from Haiti, as people know or should know, the island of Hispaniola, as it's called, is divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So France had a colony there, in Martinique, in Guyana, and got rich. All of the European countries, we have to point out, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, all of them got rich by invading other countries, so-called discovery, decimating the indigenous population, and bringing in enslaved Africans to work and build more wealth for them. There was a revolution in Haiti starting in the 1790s. On January 1st, 1804, they declared independence from France. But France and the loss of Haiti impacted U.S. history. Haiti made so much money for France that the loss of Haiti cost the French millions of dollars, and that is why they sold what we know as Louisiana Purchase, which nearly doubled the size of the United States. There's an irony of history, though, that in throwing off the chains of their enslavement in Haiti, when the U.S. suddenly had this new territory, it expanded its territory for the plantation economy. So that's a little side note. So anyway, so the Haitians throw off France's yoke. There was some conflict there. In Haiti, there were two people who claimed to be rulers, but for the purposes of our discussion, the French claimed that the Haitians owed them money for the loss of this territory. In 1825, France said that Haiti would have to pay back France 150 million francs, which was 10 times the amount the U.S. had paid for the Louisiana Purchase.
Wait, and just put this in perspective, just so everybody is clear. This is based on the notion that the people were commodities, that the human body itself, their black bodies were commodities, they were property, and that property was making them a certain amount of money, so them pushing for their freedom cost France money. Like, I want people to get how weird this is. Like, basically them saying, you pushing back and ripping away your labor from us is hurting us financially, and so you should pay us back for that. Am I getting that right? Am I characterizing that correctly?
You sure are. It's pretty basic, yeah. So France threatens to re-enslave Haiti, sent a squadron of ships, and said, if you don't start paying us, we are going to take Haiti back. And to make a long story short, Haiti ended up paying this money until 1947. It ended up being 10 times the amount that the French had sold the Louisiana territories for, and this is why Haiti is so poor today. The people were forced to pay high taxes. Haiti was not allowed to develop. So this went on until the 1940s, until after World War II. So when people say Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere and what's wrong with Haiti and why can't they do anything right, this is it. This is the explanation. And I thank you for asking me to talk about it, because it's something that very few people, first of all, that know anything about it. We're never told this. How do you talk about Haiti being poor and not talk about this? So
I think they often just assume that it's because, it's a backwards island, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think they look further into the history of it. Shane, please take it.
Well, it's just, how did Haiti come to accept that? How did Haiti, the newly independent country, come to accept the terms of that repayment process? Because, like you're saying, those are serious financial burdens, financial chains to be putting back on. How did that process come about?
The French sent warships. A squadron of, I'm reading this and I want to live on my memory, a squadron of 14 brigs of war carrying more than 500 cannons. And that was it. So it was extortion. They said, we will invade Haiti, we will reinvade your country and take your citizens, your sovereignty away by force if you don't do this. And that was in the that was the first in 1825. This happened again in the 1830s. So periodically, the French would threaten war, would threaten to recolonize Haiti if they didn't keep paying.
And this kind of goes to my point that just because you might be in the right doesn't necessarily mean it turns out right. Like, they were absolutely just in having that revolution. If you want to say that violence, like by any measure, if violence is legitimate in any context, in pushing off the yoke of slavery, has to be, right? But the fact that that's morally justified didn't necessarily stop them from being basically raked over the coals by France with military might of saying, look, you might have pulled this off once before, but we can re-enslave you. We can kill a lot of you if you don't give us X and Y. That's horrendous. What effects have that had on the let's say the growth of that country and the materialization of that country? I mean, right now they're ensconced in a certain Haiti has been ensconced in poverty for decades, for centuries even. What has been the outgrowth of that? I mean, like you said, this went to the 1900s. Well, what happened after the payments were made? And Haiti had nobody else to speak in its behalf in regards to this, or everybody else just kind of stayed pat and let this kind of gangster capitalism. Well, this is in the 1800s, so yeah, this will be nobody would have sent stuff for Haiti in this scenario. What happened after the payment of the cash?
Haiti was, not only did the French steal Haiti's money, but the U.S. has treated Haiti as a de facto colony. U.S. Marines invaded Haiti during Woodrow Wilson's presidency and stayed for some years. So Haiti has been while the French were stealing money, the U.S. was flexing its muscles, the Monroe Doctrine, the whole hemisphere belongs to the U.S. So anytime there was any stirring of independence, the U.S. would intercede. Then, of course, the Duvalier regime, Papa Doc and Baby Doc, his son, were propped up by the U.S. for decades. And they did it again, the U.S., when Bush was president, when we finally got a president elected by the people, President Aristide, when he began to speak of there were always conflicts in Haiti between those who wanted a truly liberated country and those who still were forces acting on behalf of U.S. empire. When some of those other people who were always backed by the U.S., they endangered the Aristide regime. Then Aristide spoke of the debt that France owed. The U.S. got rid of Aristide. They kidnapped him. And I will never forget that. They and took him to an African country. So between France's theft and U.S. interventions over the years, Haiti has never been truly independent. Then the UN sent troops into Haiti. Haiti is still occupied. So we have a country that's never been able to be independent, but it's always been because of the intervention by others. And I think it's very important to talk about this because Haiti is just presented as this poor country and they don't know how to handle their own affairs and they have a bunch of dictators and no one talks about the role that Europe and the United States played in creating so much chaos for this country.
And, the sad part is it's almost as if the history of the countries don't matter. Like when we look at, let's say for South America, for example, we would be like, oh, we don't like these people coming to our shores. But there's never any investigation into, the coup in this country, the kill squads in the other country, the toppling and the killing of this particular leader, let's say in Guatemala or Bolivia. Like when you're going through the history, it is a bloody, bloody, bloody history in South America in regards to what we're doing. United Fruit, just in one case, where the company buys up all of this political clout, political power, buys up railroads, buys up businesses, and gets to the point of paying people in company bucks. Like, that's how extreme it had gotten. And just the very modest trying to push back against that gets these guys called communists and have the U.S. going in killing the various people in the country. And so it's like, we don't investigate that, nor do we even give that credence as legitimacy or a legitimate reason for why the countries have difficulties. Like, it's astonishing. We just act as if the past of the country don't matter. And in the same honest way that we regard African Americans, they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps after, X number of years without having boots or straps or any of those things or socks. Like, it's a very strange way that we look at this stuff. One question, what was the media at the time reporting while the revolution was taking place in the from the standpoint of like the French media, or for that matter, the world media? I'm always curious about this because I always think power and imperialism, the media is going to take the perspective of the imperialist power, always. And so I'm curious about how media was covering this very specific instance. And you may not even know this one because this was kind of an off-ball question.
I don't, but I think we can guess. I think we can guess. I'm sure that if it was mentioned at all, that's the other thing they do. They just don't talk about certain things. If it was mentioned at all, I'm sure they took the pro-French position. Let's look at the media and what we've been told about Haiti the last few decades. It's always about war-torn Haiti, so desperate, so poor, they can't manage their own affairs. No mention. I have never seen in corporate media any mention of France's heist against this country.
Neither have I.
And when they kidnapped Aristide, the only people who spoke up were members of the Congressional Black Caucus. It was the last time they really stood up for anything important, in my estimation.
Okay, let's do this. Let's take a break. We're going to bring you back, and we're going to have a conversation with the Cuban Revolution, because that also, New Year's. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice you've been hearing, or you've been listening to, Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for the Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. We just had this awesome conversation about Haiti and the revolution that took place in Haiti in the 1800s, and France's belligerence and extortion of all sorts of money, millions of dollars from that country, because they had the temerity to withhold their labor, their servitude, basically. On the other part of this, I also want to go to Cuba. There's an interesting question that always lingers about revolutions that is never really asked prior to the revolution. They always show the damage, the blood, the war, the killing, and everything else of the revolution, but they never necessarily bring that into context in regards to the violence that has taken place to keep the previous system in place and the people who are subjugated in that previous system. It's almost like the penalty or the payment for the liberation is in and of itself the blood, and the question becomes whether or not the blood debt or the blood payment is worth it. I would imagine if you were the people who are being subjugated, the answer is yes. If you are the people who are subjugating, the answer is probably no. The Cuban Revolution is another one of those fascinating moments in world history where, again, just because they were right to rebel doesn't necessarily mean that the results in the way the world looked at them were favorably, especially with a superpower on their step that has basically had it in for them. And on this, we're talking about Cuba. Margaret, can you give a heads up or just a brief description of the Cuban Revolution and what was taking place in Cuba that was the prerequisite for that revolution? This gets into the whole alcohol, the alcohol era. Please explain.
Cuba, well, was a Spanish colony until 1898, when the U.S., so the Spanish-American War, which was fought so that the U.S. could steal Spain's colonies, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. But the Cubans always struggled for, first wanted independence from Spain. Spain, same story, settler colonial state, decimation of the indigenous population, enslavement. Half of Cuba's population is of African ancestry. And the 1890s, the U.S. comes in, steals Cuba from Spain. It is nominally independent, but is a de facto U.S. colony. There's always, though, a desire for Cuba to be truly independent. I'll fast forward. There was an attempted left-wing revolution in Cuba in the 40s, which was crushed. But Fidel Castro, I wonder how many of your listeners know Fidel Castro is an attorney. He was a well-educated man from, his father was very prosperous, but he rebelled against the system. And with the help of others such as Che Guevara, who was Argentinian, who was a medical doctor, they succeeded in the revolution began in the early 50s, and they marched into Havana successfully on January 1st, 1959. The U.S. immediately did everything in its power to try to overthrow that government. This is a Marxist revolution. They did everything from sending Fidel Castro exploding cigars. There were hundreds of attempts made by the U.S. to kill Castro. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they used Cuban exiles. They are still using Cuban exiles, by the way, to foment discord and carry out attacks in Cuba. This still happens periodically. By the way, Guantanamo Bay still belongs to the U.S. So the U.S. still has this territory on the tip of eastern tip of Cuba, has a Marine base there, and sends political prisoners there. After 9/11, people were sent on claims to be terrorists and sent there, and there are some people still there. That never changed. All the talk of closing Guantanamo has come to nothing. Like the forever wars, it's a forever prison.
And by the way, Cuban Missile Crisis was instigated because of those attempts at killing Castro. Castro, rational actor, doesn't want to die in an assassination attempt, doesn't want his country toppled, realizes that there's a problem having a superpower that's trying to get rid of him, and he goes and gets the other superpower that helps him out. There's a fascinating conversation between, I believe it's Kennedy and LBJ. I believe it's LBJ. No, not LBJ. Is it LBJ? Oh, Eisenhower. I think it's Eisenhower. And they're talking about the weapons. And they're talking about Khrushchev and whether Khrushchev really has the stones to basically launch a nuclear attack. And he's telling him, no, he's not going to do it. Nonsense. Those missiles were active already, and the order had already been given to fire those missiles if they had attacked the country. Like, all of this stuff, I love the fact that you brought up the Louisiana Purchase in relation to France because these things are tethered and tied to one another in history. They're not necessarily untethered from one another. How did they pull off this revolution? Like, in both cases, you had an overly militarized either France or Spain, or in this case, the U.S. How were they able to basically throw off the yoke of the oppressor in these scenarios?
Well, that's more information than I can give. I cannot say exactly how they did it, but they were determined to do it. I think that's the first thing. There were weaknesses in the Cuban dictatorship. First of all, it was a dictatorship. Many people were suffering because of it. Cuba was run by the U.S. mafia, which made millions of dollars there. And so people resented it. And when this group began to coalesce, obviously they gathered adherents across the country. So that's a very general way to talk about it, but it is something to look into more specifically and say exactly how this was done. But it was
another way this ties in, and this just ties. I think this is where Jamarl was going in the way that he first proposed this question when he was bringing us into the segment. You mentioned alcohol. You just mentioned the mob. Isn't it true that the United States was using Cuba as kind of a casino and like a mob destination, a place to go to get drunk and to gamble and stuff during the Prohibition era, and that legacy continued for decades following? And then during the Cuban Revolution itself, a lot of the folks who were deposed, who are thrown out of power, were mafia heads and were the owners of these facilities, of these casinos, these joints. Margaret, does that comport with your sense of history as well?
It does, but you've also reminded me of something else, how the U.S. did business with criminal elements and supported them and helped to create them. After World War II, Italy, Mussolini is gone, and many Italians wanted a left-wing government. There was fear that they would elect a communist government in Italy. The U.S. spent millions of dollars to make sure, interfered in that election to make sure communists weren't elected. One of the things they did was to empower the Sicilian mob. And we hear about the French Connection heroin. Drugs came into the United States, and this is all with connivance of the U.S. government, by the way.
One of the first CIA operations, as far as I can tell, specifically the CIA in Italy in 1948, trying to change the outcome of that election, dropping leaflets, just doing propaganda and other work like you're talking about. Anyway.
Yes. So heroin came into the United States. From the mafia in Italy, from Turkey to Italy to Marseille to New York and so on. And the U.S. government was not only aware of it, but supported it. So I'm digressing just a little bit, but just to give a little more information about the willingness of the U.S. government to use supposedly, they were criminal elements. It depended on who was in power, whether or not they minded the criminality or not. But the loss of Cuba was loss of millions of dollars to these people. And the U.S. spent decades trying to overthrow Castro. While the Soviet Union was still in existence, they supported the Cuban government and helped to soften the blow of U.S. sanctions. Now, what are sanctions? People seem to think that if the U.S. sanctions another country, it doesn't do business with that country. But speaking of the mafia, the U.S. acts like a mobster around the world. And any country under U.S. sanctions, such as Cuba, the U.S. sanctions any country who dares to break their sanctions. So if another country said, well, we don't want to listen to the U.S., we'll do business with Cuba, that country is sanctioned by the United States. So Cuba cannot get loans. Cuba, people talk about, well, Havana's, run down under the communists. Well, if you can't even import hammers and nails and paint, then yes, you'll be run down. But despite that fact, Cuba has managed to prosper in its own way. They send doctors all over the world. COVID-19 has had a very limited impact in Cuba because of their robust public health system, because they have come up with their own treatments for COVID and other diseases. So they have managed to continue to exist despite these decades of U.S. pressure and attempts to undo their revolution. But there is a connection with Haiti, where countries that dare to break free are punished for doing so.
What do you think is the lesson? What do you think? We have 30 seconds. What do you think is the lesson for us in regards to the United States and people who want change and everything else from the standpoint of Cuba and Haiti? And maybe 30 seconds is not enough time for it, but I trust you. Go for it.
Well, the lesson is that we always have to struggle. There's no magical day when struggle ends. So the Cubans succeed in their revolution, but the U.S. immediately tries to smack it down. Domestically, the U.S. destroyed the liberation movement of the 1960s through and early 70s with COINTELPRO. There's still political prisoners in jail in this country. People who've been political prisoners longer than anybody else in any other country. So we have to know that history, and we have to be prepared to struggle and to continue struggling.
The voice you guys have been listening to is Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. You can follow Margaret on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog and find her work at blackagendareport.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, another year of the most disruptive show, covering news and events across our country as well as across the fractured and battled surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting into the headlines here. First up, in COVID news, at least 2,373 new coronavirus deaths and 291,000 new cases were reported on Saturday, on January 2nd. And at least 1,353 new deaths and 201,000 new cases were reported yesterday, Sunday, on January 3rd. Over the past week, there has been an average of about 205,000 cases per day. That is a decrease of 5% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Sunday evening, more than 20,660,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and approximately 351,000 have died from it. More than 4.2 million people in the United States, meanwhile, have received a dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. That's according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That is a significant number by expectations earlier in the year, but it is falling far short of the goal that federal officials set to give at least 20 million people their first shots before the end of December, before the end of last year. The federal government said Saturday that it had delivered more than 13 million doses to states, territories, and federal agencies, but federal health officials have recently said the vaccine rollout had a slower than expected start, acknowledging that they lack a clear understanding as to why only a small portion of the doses shipped across the nation have been administered so far. India, meanwhile, has formally approved the emergency use of 2 coronavirus vaccines, those coming from AstraZeneca with Oxford University and those from local firm Bharat Biotech. This as it prepares for one of the world's biggest inoculation drives. India, which makes about 60% of vaccines globally, plans to immunize about 300 million people by July 2021. India has also announced that it will not allow the export of the Oxford University AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine for several months, according to the head of Serum Institute of India, which has been contracted to make 1 billion doses of the vaccine for developing nations. As a result, the export of vaccines to developing nations, part of COVAX, won't begin until March or April. In Israel, 2 weeks into its vaccination campaign, Israel is administering more than 150,000 doses a day with a total batch of initial shots amounting to more than 1 million of its 9 million citizens. That is a higher proportion of the population than anywhere else in the world. But one massive group is being left out of this rollout. Israel is transporting batches of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine deep into the West Bank, but only to be distributed to Jewish settlers, not the roughly 2.7 million Palestinians living there who may have to wait for weeks or months Palestinian Authority is rushing to get its own vaccines, although when asked for a time frame, the Director General of the Palestinian Health Ministry estimated the first vaccines would probably arrive in February, a month away at least. Back to the states in national political news, a growing number of Republican senators led by Ted Cruz announced on Saturday that they would object to certifying state electoral college votes on Wednesday and called for resurrecting an electoral commission to conduct an emergency audit of the results. In a statement released Saturday, the senators and senators-elect called for Congress to, quote, appoint an electoral commission with full investigatory and fact-finding authority to conduct an emergency 10-day audit of the election returns in the disputed states, end quote. This comes as the House and Senate are set to meet Wednesday for a joint session in which the individual electoral college counts from each state are announced. And in related news has come out yesterday that President Trump pressured Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to find him enough votes to overturn the presidential election and vaguely threatened him with a criminal offense during an hour-long telephone call on Saturday. This according to an audio recording of the conversation obtained first by the Washington Post. We played a couple of minutes of this earlier. I'm going to play just a snippet of the audio for this now. Andre, let's play that clip.
We have won this election in Georgia based on all of this. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, Brad. You know, I mean, having a correct, the people of Georgia are angry. And these numbers are going to be repeated on Monday night, along with others that we're going to have by that time, which are much more substantial even. And the people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, you know, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
It's wrong. That's what he's finishing saying there. It's just an interesting rebuke. And of course, that's what the Washington Post, in their sort of spliced, very short version of this clip, that's what they lead with, and then they cut right there. Anyway, Jamarl, I'm going to turn to you. These headlines sort of fit together. We were having a conversation at the opening of the show, and I agree with you fundamentally that this is very worrying. I just don't know that I would call this a coup. I see the mainstream media doing that kind of thing constantly. But a deeper problem that I know 100% that we do agree on, and that frankly the establishment media should be fixating their attention on a bit more, is just the absolute collapse of the apparent integrity of America's electoral systems, of our voting systems. And we blamed, in advance of this election and recent elections, both in 2018 and 2016, we blamed foreign parties, we blamed foreign powers. We sort of alleged in advance that they would try to take down our voting systems. It's completely, it's not the pot calling the kettle black. It is us shirking the responsibility that we should be upholding to fix the way our own system works, because frankly, it's our responsibility. It's what we need to do. And it turns out that we can't do it ourselves. Anyway, Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with you on that part. Even the appearance of impropriety is a problem. Because if somebody is in California, they can't see what is happening at some other part of the world or other part of the country. You need a certain degree of integrity in your system, meaning you need people to be able to believe it. That goes in two ways. So you don't get demagogues trying to pressure the governor or the Secretary of State to go scrounge around and find, out of the blue, thousands of votes. It's not so much that I think this very specific thing is a coup. I do think Trump should have been impeached for this, as opposed to impeached for that other nonsense. This would be what I would consider impeachable. But no, I'm talking about later. I'm talking about the next guy. My issue is what happens in a decade. Think of the trend line in the way that this stuff tends to go, where it seems to get worse and worse and worse. Things that were under the shadows becomes overt and okay. So think of perfect example, backing terrorists. So when Reagan gets caught getting around the Skirt and Bowling Act, Reagan is getting money or getting money from Iran and giving that money to kill squads in South America. Now, when Reagan gets caught with this, what does Reagan do? Reagan has to come on TV. There are all of these investigations. There's the Iran-Contra affair. You have Colonel North. You have all of this stuff. It's laborious, but they make a big deal out of it. When Obama does it, it's on the pages of the New York Times, and that's pretty much the end of it. Obama drops $1 billion into terrorists to try to topple the government. It becomes overt, and it becomes okay. It becomes one of those things of business as usual. That's my concern. It seems that the party structure and the people who are paying the parties matter more. And it seems that these guys believe that the public itself won't respond. And because the public won't respond, they can have more and more brinksmanship in this kind of area of pushing it. No, Trump may not do it, but what about the next guy? I mean, you've already set the precedent where you have all of these Republicans that says, yes, I will set myself on fire to back Donald Trump, even though he lost this race. They would do it in a heartbeat. Ted Cruz, whether Ted Cruz believes it or not, is almost irrelevant. Ted Cruz might just be doing this for popularity. My issue, my concern, and the thing I was trying to point to is the trajectory and the momentum of this is going in a direction where at some point somebody will be in positions of authority. Somebody will be okay with the brazenly stealing of the presidency. And at that point, Constitution, all of that stuff is off the table because the lie becomes persistent. You basically are saying, I won this race, and anything else at that point becomes almost acceptable. The law doesn't matter. I'm talking about a decade from now, not now.
So here's another side of this, though, and this is a slightly controversial take, maybe, but like, aren't these Republican senators, aren't they doing it because their electorate wants them to do it? Aren't they doing it because their base, by and large, wants them to throw their lot in with Donald Trump? And again, I think one way to bring this back to some shared first assumption here, some shared first belief, is this has to do with the decline in the apparent integrity of our voting systems, of our electoral process in general, where the public can't trust the results. And that was true in 2016 when the resistance movement was birthed, and they lost their faith, whatever faith they had in the current administration. It'll probably be true for so much of the Republican base 2021 going forward with Biden's administration. But isn't the base pushing politics in that direction? Like, isn't there that? You see what I'm saying? Isn't there something there too? What's your take on that issue?
I do see what you're saying. In the Democratic, it's very strange. Democrats did something very similar, right? They just did it in a different way. So the Democratic Party believes they don't want to touch the integrity of the electoral system. So Gore will gavel all of those people down saying that they were cheated, or Kerry will just kind of leave even though there were anomalies in some of the vote tallies. Clinton wouldn't challenge the vote in other states and will leave it up to Jill Stein to do it. Democrats have this belief in the integrity of the system that they don't want to touch, even in making laws to try to fix it. Republicans or Trump went at this differently, whereas Democrats basically said the Russians were infecting your mind with stuff that made these black folks get angry about cops. It made these environmentalists angry about environmental degradation. They got into your heads to get you to do that because of some kind of clickbait stuff, which, if you think about it, protects the integrity of the electoral system. It goes after the voter as opposed to the electoral system. It was the Russians that did that. Well, Trump hits the system in and of itself and saying, you cheated me outright. The system is fraudulent. Look, democracy and the people and the individuals in a society is not static. It's not a situation where there's a fixed point of view that the public can. No, there's a fluidity that goes along with it where there's almost like a call and response from the standpoint of a person who's in power versus the base of that particular individual and the people voting for it. His base will go along with it because Donald Trump came out with it. It's not the base leading the candidate. It's the candidate leading the base, with the base basically giving the candidate permission to go along with whatever the candidate is trying to do. No, that's the way I see it. I don't see it as,
and that's how it's going to work in the future.
Yeah,
and that's you're talking about a long-term decline. The demagoguery, it would saturate the Senate by the Senate having to follow what their base wants, and the base basically following the leadership of the leader of the executive of whichever person is president or is trying to become president at that crucial time. That you're saying is probably going to happen sooner than later. I think the number you gave was 10 years, was a decade. I'm not sure if it'll be that soon. I don't know, or if it'll take that long. I don't know either. But I see what you're saying. It does seem like the pendulum is swinging further and further each time it swings, and things are getting a little bit more volatile. Anyway, I have a few more headlines to go through here. I'm going to go through them. Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker of the House for the 117th Congress, clinching that gavel for the fourth time as she now prepares to steer the sharply divided chamber through the final turbulent days of the Trump era. This comes after weeks of concerted pushback from a wing of progressives calling on members of the Progressive Caucus to withhold their votes for Nancy Pelosi's reelection as Speaker unless she pushed for a vote on Medicare for all. Sadly, she did not. Sadly, that was a failure, I would say. In international news, UK District Judge Vanessa Barretzer has ruled to reject the U.S. request to extradite WikiLeaks founder and whistleblower Julian Assange. Barretzer indicated that extradition would have a harmful effect on Assange's mental health and said she ruled against the U.S. request due to fears that the whistleblower has a high risk of committing suicide as a result. In her full ruling, Barretzer wrote, quote, "I accept that oppression as a bar to extradition requires a high threshold. However, I am satisfied that in these harsh conditions, Mr. Assange's mental health would deteriorate, causing him to commit suicide with the single-minded determination of his autism spectrum disorder," end quote. The U.S. has said that it would appeal against this decision. And again, briefly, you know what? Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. But just to say this briefly, it's a weird. You'll take what you can get. It's a weird pretense to use to rule against the extradition. Well, he's going to kill himself because he's autistic. It's just strange.
It's very bizarre. It looks like she was just looking for any excuse. Honestly, it looks like she was. Look, this is outside looking in, right? I mean, this is, we can only see what is above and only from below. But based on how weird this is, I mean, I think people really need to take into account how bizarre what she's saying is. She's talking about something that's unknowable first. And then she's saying his autism will have him with the single-minded determination of killing himself because American prisons are so uniquely horrible. Now, yes, the prisons are uniquely horrible. She even went further, said he would frustrate any of the systems that they put into place to try to prevent him from killing himself. Like, that's such a, it seems like the easier thing would have been like, look, he's a journalist. I don't want the guy being sent. Or you can even say it's a political judgment, right? That you're trying to get him for political. All of these other things seem to have just as much merit, if not more so. This just seems to be a quirk of a ruling. What do you think? Why is she doing this? Or why do you think she went this weird way with it?
I don't know. I'm gonna completely say I just don't know on that one. We need to go into a break, but I genuinely, it seems as weird to me as I think it does to you. It's coming out of left field. Anyway, heartening still. Hopefully the appeal doesn't go well. Hopefully he just gets released, but we'll see about that. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory. That show airs Monday through Friday here on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, Dad, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, yeah, thank you for being with us. All right, I'm going to start actually. You say that you have to quote your tweet here, I have a new article coming out this weekend. You're going to be shocked and amazed how deep and how old Joe Biden's connections to the real story of Russiagate and Ukrainegate go. I kind of want to just have you, if you can, tell us about that story. But you brought up Milan Verveer. You were sending emails out. I saw that. Interesting connections that show her links to the Clintons going back decades before Strobe Talbot and the Clintons. And for anybody who's followed specifically your reporting on this story, those are deep roots. And it ties into Alexandra Chalupa, ties in a couple of different ways. But I'll let you pick it up, either on Milan Verveer or this story. Where would you go with that?
Okay, so a couple of things there. First off, can I just say something about the Assange thing real quickly? Since it's breaking. Yeah, I mean, I got to say, this is really great news. I was up this morning at about 4:30 when the reports started to come in, and I was watching them live. And I could see as the reports were coming in, I will be honest, it was looking very bad. Every single thing the judge was saying was, and again, this was being reported live by people you've had on the show, Joe Loria, Taylor Hudak, and other people. And I was kind of retweeting what they were saying, and everything was bad. They were saying they thought the U.S. would do a fair job. They thought that Julian Assange had violated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at a certain point, it was just depressing to me. And so I decided to go out and get a cup of coffee because I was out of coffee, and it was depressing. And then I came back, and I suddenly had internet again, and now I saw the decision that's happened. And I got to say, despite the fact that I think there's a lot of things about this judge's ruling that are bad, there's a lot of things about this judge's ruling that are negative. This is a very flippin' big deal. And it's a very big deal for a bunch of reasons. But one of them is simply that for morale, for the people who've been fighting for Julian Assange for so long, this is an incalculable victory. This is a big deal for the people who've been fighting for Assange because we were not expecting good news. If we're going to be honest, we were not expecting good news. And increasingly, nobody who's an Assange fan can be expecting good news from the Trump administration. Donald Trump is too worried about himself unless Julian Assange said, I have information on Dominion voting machines in Georgia or something like that. I don't see a pardon happening. And especially with the pressure he's got from people like Rick Grenell and Mike Pompeo. But this is a big deal because most people, we got to remember, the people on the West Coast haven't heard this yet. And so the headline people are going to get, I know how the spin's going to go, all the stuff that your judge said, but this is a very, very big victory. And everybody who's been supporting Assange for years, and all my friends in the UK, when I've been over there a few times covering this story and speaking outside Belmarsh Prison, this is a really big deal. And I will take the bizarreness that you guys were talking about before in favor of declaring victory right now. Let's declare victory, see how this goes, and redouble the fight to bring Julian home. So that's my short take on that.
I do think it's positive that he's out. Don't misunderstand me. I just think it's a weird way for her to go up, to go with it. Let me say it this way. For example, do you remember when Comey there was this big thing about Comey talking about Clinton's case, and Comey was supposed to come out. He was supposed to explain whether or not they were going to perp walk Clinton. And he gives this long speech that anybody else at the end of that speech would go to jail. And yet he finishes that speech with, so I'm letting her go. And it's like, what? It's the weirdness of it. It's like, what was going on in the individual's head to make this become true? It's that part. And that's the part that I don't quite get. The judge had all sorts of testimony dealing with this being a political case, this being a publisher. How can he be subjected to the laws of the U.S. but not with their protections? All of these things seem like legitimate arguments to let it go. But it seems like the judge was experiencing pressure. From where, who knows, but the judge was experiencing pressure. And it seems like her way of letting him go wasn't, okay, I'm going to let him go on the merits from the standpoint of him being a publisher, or this being a political motivated case, or the going into the embassy was fair. None of that. She went to, he's going to off himself because he's autistic. I just think it's a very bizarre ruling. Why do you think that was the ruling? Why do you think she ends up on that quirk of a loophole, as opposed to dealing with some of the more advanced things? So yes, I agree with you. It's a win in the sense of getting him acquitted in the short term, because there's going to be apparently an appeal. But I get the win part. But why do you think they went that route with it? That's the part that's plaguing me more than anything else, even though I'm happy he's out.
Okay, so my answer would be, today I could care less. I don't care. I'm not interested. The only thing I'm interested today is in positive messaging, because this is a big deal for the narrative. And I got to tell you, our opponents wouldn't be navel-gazing right now, Jamarl. Our opponents, you know this. They would not be going, well, I wonder why Comey didn't, that was a little strange. No, they just go, Comey clears Clinton, and they'd move right on. So today's a day for champagne and redoubling the fight. To me, that's my view. And so really, I'm really serious too. I haven't even thought about it yet. I'm figuring out what the next step is. The next step is, we've got this next hearing on Wednesday. And it's getting the message out to as many people as possible that Assange got a victory today. To me, strategically, this is a day to declare victory and let as many people know about that victory as possible. That's my, it's not, I'm not saying you're raising an invalid point.
And you can't do both. Does that make sense? Both of these things, like both at the same time, is just impossible to do.
Not on one day. Not on one day.
And yet I'm doing both. Because I'm saying it's a great idea. It's great that he's out. By the same token, why this? It is, by definition, experientially, you can do both because I am doing both right now. I understand you want a chest thump, but I'm making the point that what happens from here? Like, for example, the appeal. What is because you know for yourself, there could be political reasons for her to use this very specific way of going about saying this. You know for yourself. I mean, this isn't random. This isn't a judge coming up with just a statement of saying this quirk of a way that she's doing this. It's intentional. The question becomes, what is the intentionality behind it? That's what I'm curious about. So yeah, I'm happy that Julian Assange is let out, clearly. But I'm also curious as to why, because I think that's going to go into whether or not that appeal gets sustained and whether he gets out in it entirely. But Shane, go for it.
Well, I mean, I just think different ways of handling it. I completely hear what you're saying on this one. I think it is a massive deal. And yeah, I think that looking forward, a sort of positive approach is the right route to it. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. It is bizarre. It is confusing, but I hear what you're saying about prioritizing your attention in a sort of timely manner. Anyway, go for it. We're going to say.
Yeah, just real quickly. This is a day when millions of people who have not heard anything about Assange in a really long time are going to hear something positive. Does that make sense? Literally millions of people. This is front page news the world over. So that needs to be really taken advantage of. In the meanwhile, people who have more control over the situation than I do, like his lawyers, absolutely need to be figuring out the next move. But to me, today is like, hey, everybody, big news, journalist hero Julian Assange got a victory today. Because I know what's going to come. Ready? What's going to come is the mainstream media coverage on this will guaranteed to be focused once they're past the headline now. They're going to be focused on, look for this headline. So-called victory for Assange, not the victory it seems. Today, a judge handed down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But guess what? That's still going to be drowned out. And so today, in a one-day media cycle where nobody's been paying attention or hearing this, where there's a small group of people, tens of thousands of maybe around the world, who've been really focused on this for a few years, millions of people are going to hear about this. And that's really my point. I'm not saying this stuff's not important, but just not now. And especially, again, I'm not arguing. I'm just saying that's really my view today. I think it's very important to focus on messaging because our enemies focus on it every single day.
That's fair.
All right.
I can appreciate that. What do you think is going to happen next? I mean, the next step is getting him out of prison. That's the next step. Because right now, he is literally just a political prisoner. I mean, after the 50 days was over with, every day after that, and I would even argue the first day he was in the embassy, he was a political prisoner. Are they going to be able to get him out? That's the question.
The next step, I don't know if they're going to be able to get him out. We certainly hope so. And that's where massive public support. Don't forget, Assange had massive public support at one point. At one point, he was a beloved figure. And Russiagate kind of changed that, made a lot of Democrats hate him. Now, with the pressure off, with Trump leaving office in, a couple weeks, we're only a couple weeks from it, the pressure's off. And Democrats can mellow out a little bit and go, well, wait a minute, maybe Assange wasn't that bad. And we did like him on the anti-war stuff, and that's what they're busting him on, and so on. So I think it's going to go, I think the prosecution's already said that they're going to appeal. I think that the PR battle, you watch, again, the counter media narrative is going to be vicious. The media is not going to celebrate this. The media right now is reporting that the basic facts of what the judge said, but the pushback is going to start. You watch. Guaranteed. Op-eds, editorials, everything else saying, hey, let's slow down. This wasn't really a big victory for Assange. Look what the judge said here, and here, and here. and all that pushback. So that's to me one of the next steps in the media cycle.
And I can hear you on that one. Yeah, yes. I'm going to actually take us into an earlier break. Interesting conversation this segment. We'll bring us back. We're talking about Ukraine, Joe Biden, and more. You're listening to the voice of Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. We will be back with Lee in just a minute.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Lee Stranahan, my dad, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, is joining us. That show, The Backstory, airs Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, thank you again for being with us. Let's talk about Joe Biden and Ukraine for a minute. Joe Biden, incoming president. I know that going into his presidency, going into 2021, you saw this as a massive opportunity, speaking in terms of media cycles, to revisit and to bring back to the forefront Russiagate and Ukrainegate. There are different sides of this. What some folks may have heard about, it's pretty marginal for a lot of folks. What they would have heard about, by and large, would be Hunter Biden. What some folks may have heard about, if they've really been paying attention, is Alexandra Chalupa. Can we just talk about Milan Verveer for a second? You were sending some links showing her connections to the Clintons way back in the day. Who is Milan Verveer? How does she tie into this stuff? And what were her connections to Clinton? Why are those significant, Lee?
And you know better than almost anybody how I've been covering this for a few years. And you know that I have been saying for a while that the real story of Russiagate, everybody gets the timeline wrong. A lot of people believe Russiagate, you'll hear this all the time from people. Russiagate started the night Hillary Clinton lost, when she couldn't stand the fact that she lost and she blamed it on Russia. Now, in fact, it did not start in November 2016. We know for a fact, because there was an article in Politico magazine in January 2017 that pointed out in the spring, March and April, right around that time frame of 2016, a woman named Alexandra Chalupa, a Ukrainian-American DNC operative with close ties to the Hillary Clinton campaign and to Hillary Clinton, who worked in the Clinton White House. Alexandra Chalupa went to the Ukrainian embassy and said, I'm with the Hillary Clinton campaign in the DNC, and we want you to dig up dirt on Paul Manafort and Donald Trump. Now, we know that because she's admitted it. And this is a very well-reported story in Politico that they never followed up on. And that's in March or April. Now, remember that time frame. March, April 2016 is before the DNC hack. I'm not even debating whether it was a hack or not, but that was reported by the Washington Post in June. The material was dropped in like July, right? July, August, right around that time frame. The Podesta material came out later. So in other words, this was an operation that was in place before the hack was ever reported at all. That's in fact the truth about it. And when I've looked into this story, the other thing that happened right around that same spring time frame is that before the Steele dossier ever happened, there was something that a lot of people referred to as the Shearer dossier. That's Shearer, like hair shears, or Harry Shearer from Spinal Tap. Shearer. Cody Shearer is a Democrat operative, and he was working with Sidney Blumenthal, and he put together a dossier before the Steele dossier, and it's not insignificant. That was actually given to the FBI by Steele after he was given it. So the Clinton campaign had their own dossier, and again, this dates back to that same April-ish timeframe before there was any talk of a hack. So in fact, this is an operation that was going on before a lot of people knew it was going on. And there's no conjecture. The people, this has all been reported, but it's buried by people who want to talk about the later events. So first off, does that make sense? The timeline is different than people think. Does that make sense, guys?
100% to me. Of course, I've been following this. Jamarl, how about you?
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. We've talked about this one before, the Cody Shearer document coming out before. Yes. So yeah, totally. We're on the same page.
Now then I tried to figure out why this is going on, because when I started to see this, honestly, I didn't know much about Ukraine. And Shane knows this. I didn't know anything about it. So back in 2017, when I was reporting on this, I saw that Ukraine was involved, but I didn't understand it. And then I found out, for instance, that Strobe Talbot is the connection to Cody Shearer for Bill Clinton, and that Strobe Talbot was Bill Clinton's Oxford roommate in 1969. And I'm like, oh, it's interesting. So this is one of the origins of Russiagate, going back to 69. It's one of Bill Clinton's oldest and closest friends. And I knew about a woman named Milan Verveer. And I'd seen her name come up. And Shane, you and I have talked about Milan Verveer just personally for years, right? But yes. I don't think, and tell me if I'm wrong, Shane, I didn't think that she was, I didn't see her being centrally active in this. I could see she was important. And I had always assumed, because she was Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, who is Milan Verveer? Ukrainian American, Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, member of the Trilateral Commission Council on Foreign Relations, incidentally, if you're into that kind of thing. And I had assumed, Shane, and I assume you did too, that she had come into this picture when she started working for Hillary Clinton. Is that what you thought?
Yes, and the main way that she came in specifically to the Alexandra Chalupa story was she had helped to organize an event back in, I think it was June of 2016, that that Chalupa attended, and that was sort of like a way in which Chalupa was integrated with not just the DNC but with the State Department, with the Clintons, et cetera.
No, that's right. Now, here's what I found, Shane. Because this past weekend, January 1st, is Stefan Bandera's birthday. He's the Nazi who is idolized by a number of Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians. They do the Tiki Torch March every year. And a lot of Ukrainian Americans, almost all the Ukrainian American diaspora, the people here, are Banderites broadly. They support this right-wing Nazi collaborator and a guy named Mykola Lebed, who was sort of the diaspora version of Stefan Bandera. But anybody can look up Ukraine Torch March, and you'll see them carrying pictures of the rather male pattern baldness Stefan Bandera and that group of people. And we've talked about them before. So I was going to do an article, because I'm getting back into journalism for 2021, written journalism. And I started to do research, Shane. So here's what I found. And Jamarl, I'm not including you. Just Shane and I have literally been talking about this stuff for like 4 years. And
it's your son. I don't. You're fine. Yeah, you're fine.
I don't.
You're fine.
Yeah. No. So I just don't want you to feel here. Group hug. Come here, Jamal. Give me a hug. Okay. So, but here's what I found. Milan Verveer knew Bill Clinton from about 1964 or 65. She has known Bill Clinton longer than almost anybody in Washington, D.C. And there's no conjecture about this. Anybody can look this up. Type in Milan, Melanne, Verveer, which is a Dutch name, Verveer. That's her husband's name. I'll talk about him in a second. Milan Verveer, oral, Keep typing. History. And don't just stop there because it could be disturbing. But Milan Verveer, oral history. And you will find an interview that she did in 2004. And it's really long and detailed. And she and her husband, Phil Verveer is a former State Department official. Phil Verveer is an attorney, and he's been deeply involved in this stuff too. He has known Bill Clinton since 1964, when they were both students at Georgetown. So this is literally one of Bill Clinton's closest and oldest friends in Washington. Furthermore, he met his wife at Georgetown, and they quickly got married. Milan quickly got married to Phil Verveer. She was studying Russian at Georgetown, and by the way, also teaching, and I've not nailed this down yet, teaching at Georgetown right around this time, I think in the same years, was a guy named Dostoevsky, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, but he's a Ukrainian Banderite who is very significantly important. And interestingly, Milan Verveer was studying Russian. Now, she's a Ukrainian American, and her family came over from Ukraine in the late 1800s. But she's talked about how into this Ukraine thing she is. She grew up in Pennsylvania. She went to Ukrainian schools, including a Ukrainian boarding school. And that means she was steeped in Ukraine, Russia-hating propaganda, because all these Banderites hate Russia, like passionately, in a way that few of us actually can even identify with. It's drilled into them from childhood. The people who, I'm not saying every Ukrainian, but all these Ukrainians really, really, really hate Russia. And so the fact that she goes back as a Ukrainian activist to 1964 or 5. Now, you got to remember, Bill didn't meet Hillary until the early 70s. So she's actually known Bill Clinton longer than she's known Hillary. And this goes to the point I've been making for a while, but this really reinforces it. The Russiagate story, Bill and Hillary Clinton, to do this Russiagate operation, brought in their closest friends, people that they've known for over 50 years. It is staggering. These are people that they are extremely close to. And what came out of this to me is I didn't know how deep it was. And by the way, Verveer also, I'm just going to mention this, 2 points. The other thing that came up in this Chalupa story, you'll remember this, Shane. Marcy Kapur, who is a Ohio congresswoman. Chalupa said, we're going to go to Marcy and try to have hearings about Trump. Now, again, remember, this is before any of the WikiLeaks stuff was known about or dropped. She wanted to have Marcy Kapur from who's the head of the Ukrainian caucus in Congress involved. Milan Verveer in this interview talks about, now Marcy Kapur has been in office since the 80s. She's one of the longest serving congresswomen. She's the longest serving congresswoman in Congress. Verveer's known Kapur since before she was running. And she talks about that in this article too. So this is somebody who's known Kapur since the early 80s. What is that, 30 years, something like that, a huge amount of time. So really, I'll leave it there because I've been saying a bunch of stuff, but Shane, especially since you and I have been spitballing about this stuff for years, you see why I think this material is significant and really kind of glues together the Clinton connection to this in a way even deeper than we'd had before?
It does. I mean, another way of looking at this is it also just shows the Clintons, whether it was Bill or Hillary, like to work with their friends. Of course, that's just politics. But the fact that they were working with their friends and that their friends seemed to have been so integral to Russiagate back in 2016, like you've been saying, I do see why you got excited about this new story. We've only got a couple of minutes here. And we should get you back on after you publish this because I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about here. And there are many more sides of the story with Ukraine-Gate, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump that we could be talking about. But you have a new story coming out maybe this weekend, sometime soon. What's the subject of this new story about Joe Biden and Ukraine?
So yeah, I got a little sick over the weekend, so I wasn't able to get as much. I slept like 12 hours yesterday, but this story I'm working on involves Joe Biden's deep connections going back to the 80s to this Ukrainian diaspora. You've got to understand, this Ukrainian diaspora, they hate Russia, deep-seated hate Russia. And Joe Biden's been involved with them. And a number of these people, Vindman's part of the Ukrainian diaspora. When you start to look into this, they're everywhere in this story affecting things. And his connections go back to these Banderites to the 80s. And I'm going to start to outline in a series of articles I'm doing called Biden and Bandera, tying in this literal, if you look into Stefan Bandera, by the way, horrible person. Nicole Lebed, horrible person. These are murderers. These are war criminals that were backed by the U.S. CIA. And it's not a shock that Sharmella and the CIA showed up in this story later. The CIA has been working with this Ukrainian diaspora. They let them take out their hate on Russia. And in the meanwhile, CIA's got their own reasons for hating Russia. But they've been working closely with people like Lebed, who died in this country, protected by the CIA. So I'm going to start to lay out that entire part of the story, including Biden's connections, again, going back to the early 80s to these Ukrainian groups, these Ukrainian diaspora groups. And you'll see exactly why this whole thing's developed with the Clinton connections, with the Biden connections to the Ukrainian diaspora, and why the Russiagate story really played out why it did. So this has been sort of the culmination of a lot of work I've been doing. As I've started to get back into the research, I'm coming across gems like this thing about Milan Verveer, who, again, I had no idea that she was a Bill Clinton connection. She's one of his oldest and closest friends in D.C. And by the way, one other quick note. She, in the early 80s, was an executive director at People for the American Way. That's the Norman Lear-funded group. They currently fund Right Wing Watch, currently funded by Soros. Well, at the time, she was connected to this group via the Tides Foundation, who was funding the group, who later went on, I think it was later, it's right around that time, became a Soros-connected group. So it's possible Verveer helped bring Soros into this. And the first article I have coming out, I'll show how the CIA very well may have possibly brought Soros into this operation. This is very significant. I want to say it again. The CIA may have been the people who brought Soros in. There is some reason to believe that from the CIA's own files. That's part of what's coming out here. And I want you to think about how big a deal that is. It's not like Soros.
When you say, real quick, we're over time already, but when you say this operation, which operation specifically are you talking about? Real quick, because we got to go to a break here.
I'm talking about the operation to promote anti-Russia via using the Ukrainian diaspora. And
I see.
And part of Soros's virulent anti-Russianness. Soros has really been, he's not a funder of the left. Yes, he is. He's not really just a boogeyman for the right. Yes, he is. But he's really a guy that I think the CIA brought in to fund an anti-Russia operation. And nobody on the left or right thinks of him that way. But when you start to see it laid out, it's very clear his connections to the CIA, his connections to Ukrainian diaspora with connections to the CIA, the Chomiak family. And by the way, this connects to Christina Freeland, one of the most powerful people in Canada right now. That's just a little hint there. But it's
we'll have to come back to that.
Yeah,
we'll have to come back to a lot more of that and to the Soros connection to it. Very interesting. Lee, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, guys. Happy New Year, Shane. And Jamarl.
Happy New Year to you too. Yes, yeah, don't make him feel discluded. All right, Lee Stranahan, that was the voice of Lee, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and you could be listening to other callers too soon. Our phone lines are now open, 202-521-1320. We will be back taking calls on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky,
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunday, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increase activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we are taking calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Our phone lines are now open. This is a big day. I will say this. I thought that the major story today was going to be the release of that Trump phone call between Trump and Georgia's Secretary of State, where Trump is pressuring him basically to overturn or at least further investigate, however you want to put it, Georgia's election in the presidential election. I thought that was going to be the big news story today. Instead, what we got was remarkable and charming and delightful, which is Julian Assange apparently on his way potentially out of prison. Big move there. Anyway, we're taking calls on all that and more. 202-521-1320 is the number. Jamarl, I don't think I've asked you this one yet. We're in a new year now. Do you have any resolutions?
No, actually, I didn't. I mean, this year has been pretty heavy, but it's been heavy for a lot of people. I hadn't even made any resolutions. I just kind of stumbled into the year. How about you?
I do not know. No, I've very, very rarely done resolutions. They get such a bad rap.
What do you mean resolutions? Because people can't live up to them?
Exactly, and that's like the reputation they have. Practically before I think of doing a resolution,
well, I think the thing is,
the
people
failure that you would have with it.
In that moment, they care greatly. It's like anything else. It's like, I need to lose 20 pounds. In that moment, you feel it. You're an absolute one with the universe that you want to do X, and then that moment changes, right? In every incentive, everything that's pulled on you to not do those exercises for the past year comes into play. I mean, it's not easy.
It's true.
It's easy to feel some kind of way in a moment. Like I said, people are fluid in regards to how they think about that stuff and trying to get your energies to go in a direction. I always call it catch the wave. That's the way I call it. Because to me, my feeling is at some point I am going to either not eat for a day, just random, just probability. On some point, I may not feel well. I may get something in. Run with it. Because it's really hard sometimes to get stuff done from a standing start. I am immediately going to change my diet to a vegetarian. That's going to fail on its face. Or I am going to just open up this weight loss program and I'm going to start going to the gym. It's far easier if you plan that stuff out. It's like, all right, my job is here. There's a gym in between. So on the way home, I can stop by the gym. Well, that at the very least makes it available to you. Like if you're walking outside and there's a trash can, you will most likely use it if you had trash. And you increase the probability of people using the trash can if you put a trash can there. And you increase the probability of people throwing trash on the ground if you don't have the trash can there. I think the same thing is true with the gym. The more convenient those things are, the better off you have of accomplishing them. It's not just this kind of willpower thing. I think resolutions fail for that very specific reason. They're just done in the moment. And it's not necessarily the underlying aspects of it that need to make that thing successful. It's just not there. So, but no, I haven't had it. I'm not against them. And, some people, if they say, yeah, I'm going to do this year, and they plan out for it. For example, my wife and I, when we went traveling, it was a resolution to do it. It wasn't a resolution per se. It was mostly, our mind was just kind of made up. This is what we're going to do. And even up until the day when we bought the tickets, I don't think I entirely believed that we were going to do it. Like, it was just like, there's no way this is happening. This is so surreal. There's no way this is happening. This is so surreal. And yet, here I am buying the tickets. Here I am leaving the house. Here I am getting on the plane. Like, it was like at all of these moments, it felt so surreal. Like, this really is never going to happen, even though you're making plans and adjustments for it to happen. But no.
Suddenly you're in it.
Yeah, suddenly you're in it. It's like gravity, right? It's like the hardest part is not falling. That's the easy part. The hardest part is just getting up there and getting the courage to do it.
Or getting back up. You know what? We got callers. I think we should go to them. We got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
I have a comment, but before I get to my comment, Happy New Year's to everyone. Hashtag bail today for Julian Assange. Hashtag MF Doom forever. He passed away 2 months ago, and they announced his death last week.
On Halloween. That was a weird. There was just highlighting that too. Yeah, MF Doom, Mad Villain among others, that passed away apparently on Halloween, and then his record label only released news of this I think on Friday. But just pitching in on that. Didn't mean to cut you off.
I go more into that tomorrow. I gotta look more into it. Okay, my comment dealing with the voter fraud. That's what they said they're gonna on January the 6th that they're gonna show with Vice President Prince, because he's the leader of the Senate. He can ask for 10 days extension, emergency to order the vote. If Ratcliffe come up with evidence and others dealing with the military or whatever, they can use that to order the vote. Linwood been on a tweet storm. He's saying some things I don't agree with. But if he have truth, if he a fraction of 10% true about what he's saying, then the doo-doo can hit the fan and things can change. So we'll see.
It will hit the fan, but not for the reason that I think you're implying. What is Pence using to justify taking that action? Trump has been in one courtroom after the next. Trump has had his lawyers running around the country. They've opened up for all evidence, meaning he's a president of the United States. All of the powers at his disposal, billions. He's a billionaire. He has all of these other billionaires that are working in his interests. I guess what I'm asking is, what does he have legally to give him any pretext to do this? And if he does do this, you realize that law is off the table. You're in uncharted waters from the standpoint of your government, because what is taking place is basically just a persistent lie that these guys are attending to at this point. You understand that?
I have to disagree with you. We don't know that it is a persistent lie that the country know. If they come up with evidence of massive fraud, because some of these cases a whole bunch of cases been thrown out of court. They were saying there wasn't standing. They threw that Texas case out of court because they said it wasn't standing because Texas was getting involved with another state's business, like I think Georgia or Pennsylvania.
I know, Tarif, but listen to what I'm saying. You don't think it's weird at all that in all of these states that Donald Trump hasn't been able to win cases? You don't think that's bizarre? And you don't think that that something at this point, several months in, would have come out to give him some credence or credibility in this? I guess, to me, it is a persistent lie. Trump, these guys have nothing. All right, let's do this. We have to end this. I apologize, Tarif. We have to end this because we have other callers. But we'll get back to it. You'll be able to talk about it tomorrow. Shelly in Michigan. Shelly, what's going on? You have about 30 seconds.
She's gone.
Oh, okay. Well, Brave. What's going on, Brave? From ATL. Brave?
Are you there, Brave? Oh, man. Okay. Maybe we lost him, too. Maybe he put down the phone. Maybe he's muted.
He's there.
No, but
I am
neither muted. Oh, there you are. Brave from Atlanta. You're on. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's going on, guys? I was just saying that I believe the first Happy New Year's. I think the actual persistent lie is that our elections have integrity in the first place, because we all know that they don't. Second, I would say that a lot of information has come out. You guys had a discussion on this very show with Congo Couch. And third of all, I would say that, you know what? I'm happy to have Trump and them disrupt and continue to challenge. I wish that Bernie would have had the ability to, let's say, the fortitude to have done it. And I'll close by saying that he is the president, but just look at his track record. He has not managed very well at all. I would say that he's basically one of us sitting there with no control over his administration. So where the powers you would think that he would have at his disposal, he clearly doesn't have. I mean, he could, you know what I'm saying? So I'll leave it there. But great show this morning, guys.
Hey, thank you, Brave. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. For all the people are talking about how Trump was like on his way to becoming a dictator, on his way to planning a coup, whatnot, I agree. In some sense, I agree. A lot of this stuff is worrying. I don't like what Trump's doing, but I really don't like what the establishment's doing. And like at the end there, Brave, his own administration was so against him. He was so, in that sense, he was pretty darn weak. But we have to come back to that tomorrow, some other day. You guys have been listening to our first episode this year. Hope everybody has a good new year. We'll see you again tomorrow, folks. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the books, the first show of the new year. I am so glad we were able to get Margaret Kimberly on. She is always great to talk to. I always enjoy her. Niko also. Niko's always a great conversation. In fact, everybody we had on was good, especially Tom Whitmore. Love the guy, affable, love the UFO talks. Look, I got to be honest, I'm not sure what this week is going to look like in regards to the show. Last night, my mom just gave a heads up that my grandmother passed. We knew this was going to happen. And I think I mentioned this on the show once before, that there was an expectation. So I will be going to Richmond at some point. So I don't know what that's going to look like from the standpoint of the shows. I am going to have a show today with Lauren Steiner on Force the Vote. We're going to have a conversation about that. I strongly suspect that show will probably get a lot of downvotes. Lauren agrees with me on this, that Force the Vote is a damn good idea. Should have been done. That the people in Congress should have pushed it, that they should have drew a line in the sand, basically saying this is new territory. We are no longer going to play this nonsense of beseeching and pretending as if all of us are on good sides when we're not on the same side. We're not on the good side. And fact of the matter is, like I said, the environment to which we find ourselves demands, not just insist, demands votes on Medicare for all. It demands being adversarial. So it is problematic to me that the squad has basically turned into the new incrementalists, and Democrats have basically turned into not even that. Yeah. I'll leave it here. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. You may see me today because I kind of want to do a few videos before because nothing is basically going to happen today. Your argument comes out of think civility. No, my argument comes because I was raised with a mom that told me and explained to me very well that when you're interacting with people, the boundaries of conversation and the boundaries of debate are being set there. And if you can't have a conversation, especially allies, if you can't have a conversation with an ally without screaming and swearing at them, then they have no reason to talk to you. They're not going to talk to you. They're not going to engage with you on that. And I'm sorry, you can buy and smoke this propaganda that, well, I should be able to say whatever I want to people, any way I want to people, and they should just understand the better aspect of nonsense. That's fucking ridiculous. Nobody lives by that. If you were in an argument, somebody was swearing at you in the middle of the street, you're not looking at the better angel of their nature. You're looking at the fact that they're being belligerent and lying and being disingenuous. And just because civility politics, this nonsense gets put out there, where, let's say, like the Neera Tandons of the world, the Joe Bidens of the world, don't want you to push on them, don't want you to try to get them to push for their policies and everything else. That's different then swearing belligerent at AOC acting as if she's standing between you and Medicare for all. Not only is it not true, but the swearing and whatnot is problematic, dude. Nobody functions like that in real practice. And I get a bunch of lefties want to tell themselves that the world should function this way. It doesn't. Nobody believes that in real terms. That's only some tribalism shit that people tell each other in order to justify the behavior of the tribe. In real terms, and whether you realize it or not, if your objective in Force the Vote was to get Medicare for all passed, swearing and belligerence actually undermine your objective. Meaning how you put it out there matters. What you say matters. How you talk to people matters, especially when those people are on your own side. The idea that AOC is an enemy is nonsense. I hate the fact that these guys didn't back Force the Vote. I backed Force the Vote all the way back from day one when I first came about the idea. Multiple videos making arguments on it. And the argument that was always used against people like me who was pushing for it was fucking Jimmy Dore. Think about what I'm saying to you. The argument wasn't against Force the Vote. The people who were always against it was basically just arguing Dore. That ended up being the fucking argument. So instead of Dore pushing a great idea, Dore became the argument in and of itself. It's almost like a referendum on him. You can basically agree with everything that's part of Force the Vote. And the people who back it, it's not enough. You also have to agree with the way Dore articulated it. And that's ridiculous. I'm sorry, that's absurd. I don't buy the tribalism shit. Under normal circumstances, I am alienated in general. Meaning, I don't tend to have allies, like talking about. I've gotten to the point I don't even expect them. Team environments, all of that stuff. I have no expectation of the team backing me. Whether, and I mean this just somewhat as an absolute. I thrive in that environment. Because at that point, I understand the rule set. In this very specific situation, the notion of the tribe and the notion of falling in line with the tribe as if the tribe is correct in each and everything the tribe does is nonsense. Just because you have a good idea doesn't mean the way you articulate the idea is always adequate, is always good, is always right. And yes, can be counterproductive, especially if the way you're going to articulate it is going to be used by your enemies to undermine it, which basically is what literally took place. Force the Vote was undermined by Force the Vote. Whether these guys were going to back it or not, the vitriol, the things that were being said were so indefensible, especially at that rally or that virtual thing, that the pressure that might have been there gets alleviated because you end up with a lot of other people that basically aren't on Twitter, that aren't immediately, or who don't know who Dore is. That it alleviates the pressure. My point in backing this, and my point is saying, look, how this is articulated matters, is because as a flat fact, how it's articulated matters. And whether you want to realize that or not, that's on you, Pop. You can focus on the goal with Assange, why not Jimmy? Because Jimmy's goal or Jimmy's tactic undermined whatever the goal was. If you assume, let's say you give Jimmy Dore the benefit of the doubt. Personally, I think the people who back him and the people who don't care about the screaming or the disrespect, the people who think it's perfectly okay to have somebody on the show and then scream the person down when they disagree with you, you don't believe me? Go back and look at the segments. And then use a justification because, oh, he has a medical issue, he has a medical issue. Dude, there's nobody on this planet that wants Medicare for more than I do. Nobody. I've had on the brink of death twice, more than one occasion. I've been without insurance after having a transplant fail. Think about that. Without Medicare, without any other kind of health insurance, without a kidney. I'm making the point to you that the scenarios that you ascribe to Dore, I meet many times over. I've had more surgeries than Dore 2 or 3 times over. I would guarantee you the medical issues, the pain and all that stuff doesn't hold a candle. And I still don't have this belief that you can act any fucking particular way that you want. And the people who excuse that behavior are in some part the problem because you incentivize them to behave just that way. So yeah, feel how you want to feel, Pop. Leave if you want to leave. Unsubscribe if you want to subscribe. The cancel culture shit, I don't play into. The tribal shit, I don't play into. I will give you my honest opinion and the way I see things. If you don't want to see the nuance in favor of this nonsense of backing somebody, fair enough. But the nuance is there. You can have a good idea and you can articulate that idea poorly. You can argue that idea poorly. And the idea that other people who don't like you or enemies of you are supposed to see the betterment of the idea and not necessarily the vitriolic way that it was pronounced. That is not reality. When Republicans, for example, voter ID laws, Republican would say, hey, anybody can go get a voter ID. That's true. They would even say that it's no excuse for black folks not to just go to the polls and get an ID. That's not a poll tax. Anybody can get that. Anybody can get that. So it's not a big idea. The catch here is human behavior matters. And human behavior is going to have that 1 or 2%, maybe 3 or 4, pushed off. That's all you need. It's known in advance. The reason that the IDs and the laws are put up there in the first place is to create that barrier. I need to get rid of 3% of the voting population. This allows me to do it. I don't need to get rid of everybody. It doesn't need to get rid of everybody. No, human nature alone is going to create the situation where the majority of the people may go, but a large segment are not. And that segment that is not is going to be wiped off because of the policies that are put in place. The humanity of it, the human nature of it, is what makes it fucked up, because you can kind of know just based on probability alone that it's going to happen. I'm making the point that in advance, if you are arguing something and you are dealing with somebody who is an ally or somebody who is relatively close, or at the very least somebody who's going to listen to you, how you articulate it matters. I'm not saying don't yell. I'm not saying not to get angry. I'm not saying not to throw shit. But I am saying that if you want to be heard, if you don't want to become the object as opposed to the thing that you're trying to affect, meaning if the goal of it is to force the vote on Medicare for all, and the goal of it is not emphasis on door, if the goal of it really is to force the vote and to get the Medicare for all passed, then all objectives and all concerns should be given to that. And if you are stuck having to make the argument, the propagandistic argument that other people don't buy into, nobody believes in real terms, that basically you should be able to say however you want to say it and they should just accept it, I think that's nonsense. Yeah, I think that's nonsense. So, yeah, we disagree. I love the idea of forced to vote. Damn sure they should have pushed it, made multiple videos arguing the reasons for it. If you don't want to accept my reasoning for it, if you don't want to even dig into the nuance, that says more about you than me. So I'm good with my position. This is a hill I'm willing to die on. Every fucking person can leave, and I would be good to die on this hill. I have issues doing videos where I fuck up, where I say something that I get it wrong, or I say something that I regret later, where I was like, oh man, I missed. This is not one of those things. I'm very clear on this. My mom, I am my mama's child, and she was very clear early on that it's not how you say it, or it's not what you say, it's how you say it. How you say it matters. And this notion that you're supposed to give somebody basically an alcoholic swearing belligerently a pass. Fuck that. If a grown man screamed at me like Doris screamed at some of the women that were on that channel, he would have gotten punched in the fucking nose. And ultimately allowing that behavior, giving him money for it, and not just giving him money for it, saying, yeah, that's great because he had healthcare issues, isn't helpful. So you all can disagree, have at it. I get the tribal shit, but yeah, I don't buy that. Yes, fight like hell for Medicare for all. Yes, push like hell. Yes, yell, bitch and moan. All of that stuff is fine. Nothing was wrong with pushing force to vote. Nothing was wrong with even pushing AOC. Nothing was wrong with even hitting AOC on this stuff. And I think that's my point, right? I don't have an issue with somebody being aggressive. Aggressive is not my issue. But this went beyond that. And yeah, not just that, it also failed. So there's that. Like, share, and subscribe.